The smell reached her before anything else did. Myra Solon was on her knees between two archive shelves, pressing a loose floor panel back into place with both palms when the air shifted. It was subtle, so subtle that most people would not have noticed it at all. But Myra had spent 4 years working in the East Wing archive room, and she knew the way air moved through this building the way a fisherman knows the pull of a river. She knew which vents pushed warm air and which pulled cool air. She knew which corridors carried the smell of the palace kitchens in the morning, and which smelled of old paper and ink all day long. She knew every small, quiet, ordinary thing about this place. And this was not ordinary. She stayed on her knees for a moment, her palms still flat on the floor, her head tilted slightly to the left. The smell was faint, chemical, not like cleaning fluid, not like paint, not like anything she had a ready name for. It reminded her of the time a lamp had overheated in the records room 3 years ago just before it caught fire. That particular sharpness in the air, that dry, almost electric quality. But there was no lamp near the vent from which the smell was coming. There was only the ventilation grate, low on the wall at the far end of the shelf row, half hidden behind a stack of rolled map cases. Myra stood up slowly. She brushed dust from her trousers, tucked a loose strand of dark hair behind her ear, and walked toward the grate at an unhurried pace. She had learned long ago that the best way to look at something unusual in a palace was to look at it as though it were the most normal thing in the world. Palace staff noticed people who moved with urgency. They looked past people who moved like furniture. She crouched in front of the grate and looked through its narrow openings. The duct beyond was dark, she could see nothing, but the smell was stronger here, a thin, persistent thread of it, and it was coming from inside the duct. She sat back on her heels and thought about this for a long time. Then she went to her desk, opened her personal notebook to page 47, and wrote 3 lines. East Wing, Shelf Row 7, low vent, south wall, chemical smell, not on any maintenance schedule. Date, Tuesday. She underlined the last 2 words, not on any maintenance schedule. That was the part that mattered. She had access to every maintenance schedule in the East Wing. She had catalogued them herself when she first arrived. She knew what was supposed to happen in this building and when, and nothing was supposed to happen near that vent today or this week or this month. She capped her pen, closed the notebook, and went back to work. Myra Solon was 23 years old. She had been classified Omega at the standard age of 16, in a small processing office in the town where she grew up, by an assessor who had looked at her for approximately 45 seconds before stamping her paperwork and moving on to the next person in line. She remembered the assessor's face clearly, not because it was unkind, but because it was perfectly indifferent. That indifference had followed her everywhere since. It was the texture of most people's attention when they looked at her, not hostile, not cruel, simply absent. She had learned to use it. In school, she had been the student who passed every examination without anyone knowing she had studied. In the town records office where she had worked for 1 year after graduation, she had reorganized the entire filing system before her supervisor noticed anything had changed. When she applied for the position at the Palace Archive, the hiring officer had reviewed her application and hired her in the same motion, without looking up from his desk. She had been here 4 years, and she was relatively certain that if she walked out of this building today and never came back, it would be at least 3 weeks before anyone filed a formal inquiry. This was, in its own quiet way, an advantage. The Palace Archive was not a glamorous posting. It was a large, cool room full of shelves, and the shelves were full of documents: old court decisions, land surveys, supply contracts, guard rotation logs, maintenance records, catering invoices, staff registrations, diplomatic correspondence that was decades old and referred to countries that no longer existed by the names they once had. Myra's job was to receive new documents, catalog them, store them correctly, and retrieve them when requested. She was good at it. She was, in fact, extraordinarily good at it, in the specific way that very organized people are good at tasks that reward organization. She had built a cataloging system so efficient that retrieval requests that used to take 2 days now took 20 minutes. But no one had remarked on this. Records moved faster, and everyone simply assumed that records had always moved at this speed. She did not mind. She had her own reasons for being here. The palace was a world built on information. Every decision that shaped the kingdom passed through this building in one form or another, and the residue of those decisions, the documents, the schedules, the invoices, the contracts, ended up, eventually, in the archive. Myra had understood this from her first week. She had begun quietly and methodically to read everything, not to use it for anything, not to tell anyone what she knew, simply because she was curious and because knowledge, even knowledge that seemed useless, was the only thing in her experience that had never let her down. Over 4 years, she had developed an extensive and detailed understanding of how the palace operated. She knew the guard rotation schedules better than most of the guards did. She knew which suppliers had contracts and which had quietly been dropped for reasons that were never officially stated. She knew the name of every staff member in every wing, their arrival dates, their assignments, and their access levels. She knew the maintenance schedule for every ventilation system in the building. Which was why the smell on Tuesday morning stopped her cold. She spent the rest of Tuesday working normally. She catalogued a new batch of supply invoices. She retrieved 2 land survey documents for a junior court official who came to the desk, spoke at her rather than to her, and left without making eye contact. She organized the incoming shelf. She ate her lunch at her desk, a habit she had developed in her first month because the staff dining room required a level of social navigation that she found exhausting and unrewarding. On Wednesday morning, she arrived at the archive before the building was fully awake, before the day shift of corridor guards had finished their handover, before the kitchen staff had started the breakfast service. She let herself in with her key, crossed to the south wall, and crouched again in front of the vent grate. The smell was still there, fainter perhaps but present. She spent that day pulling ventilation maintenance logs from the previous 3 months. This was entirely within her job description. Maintenance logs were archived documents. She had every right to them. She spread them on a table at the back of the room away from the main desk, where no one would see what she was reading if they happened to come in, and she went through them carefully, page by page, line by line. The East Wing ventilation system had been serviced once in the past 3 months, on a date 6 weeks ago, by a contractor listed as Greywood Facilities, under a scheduled inspection code that corresponded to the annual duct cleaning cycle. She checked the annual duct cleaning schedule. The schedule showed no East Wing service for another 4 months. She checked the contractor registration files. Greywood Facilities appeared once in the system, in a vendor list that had been updated 7 weeks ago, registered at an address in the Outer District. She wrote this down on page 47, below her Tuesday notes. Then she checked the filter replacement log for the East Wing. A filter had been replaced in the south wall duct, shelf row 7, 9 days ago. The replacement was logged under a routine maintenance code. The signature belonged to a guard named Corbin Lale from the facility's support unit. She pulled the guard rotation log for that day. Corbin Lale had been on approved personal leave. He had not been in the building. She set the log down very carefully on the table. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened her notebook to page 47 and wrote, "Filter replaced by signature of guard on leave, not possible." She went home that evening and slept badly. In the place between waking and sleep, her mind kept assembling pieces that she would have preferred not to assemble. She was not a suspicious person by nature. She believed, generally, that bureaucratic errors were more common than deliberate ones, that missing signatures usually meant sloppy paperwork rather than something darker. She had built her understanding of the palace on the assumption that most of it ran the way it was supposed to run, with ordinary inefficiencies and ordinary failures and ordinary people making ordinary mistakes. But a filter replaced by a guard who was not present was not an ordinary mistake, and a contractor who appeared in the vendor registry 7 weeks ago and nowhere before that was not an ordinary contractor, and a smell inside a duct that had been recently and incorrectly serviced was not ordinary at all. On Thursday morning, she pulled 3 more sets of records. The vendor registry for the past 6 months, to check for other new entries that did not match standard procurement timelines. The catering invoices for the past 8 weeks, because catering was one of the departments with regular access to internal service corridors, and the court event schedule for the next 30 days. She found 2 more anomalies in the vendor registry. A linen supply company registered 6 weeks ago with no prior history, and an equipment maintenance firm registered 8 weeks ago with a physical address that, when she checked the district property records she had access to through cross-archive cataloging, corresponded to a vacant lot. She found a catering invoice for a private dinner, dated 3 weeks ago, for a function in the East Hall. She checked the event log. There had been no function in the East Hall 3 weeks ago. She wrote all of this down on pages 47, 48, and 49 of her notebook. Then she turned to the court event schedule. The state banquet was in 7 days. It was the largest formal event on the palace calendar. Every senior official, Every court dignitary, every department head, every wing commander would be present. The seating arrangement placed the king, Aldrich Voss, at the head of the main table in the East Dining Hall. The East Dining Hall sat directly above the service tunnel junction, connected to the south wall ventilation system of the East Wing. Myra put her pen down. She sat at her desk for a long time without moving. Through the archive room's single high window, she could see a narrow strip of sky going from pale blue to the deeper gray of mid-morning clouds. She could hear the distant sounds of the palace corridor, footsteps, the creak of a door, the muffled exchange of two guards changing positions at the East Wing entrance. She opened her notebook again. She looked at the pages she had filled, the dates, the names, the anomalies, the chain of small, wrong things that one by one might each be explained away but together made a shape she could not unfocus her eyes from. She thought about the smell in the duct. She thought about the banquet. She thought about what it would mean if she was right and said nothing. Then she thought about what it would mean to say something. She was an Omega archivist in the East Wing. She had no rank, no authority, no official standing in anything that happened outside this room. She had a notebook full of cross-referenced documents that she had pulled entirely on her own initiative, for reasons she could not officially explain without explaining that she had begun investigating something she had no mandate to investigate. In a palace built on hierarchy, in a world built on hierarchy, the distance between her and the people who made decisions about palace security was not a gap. It was a cliff. She closed the notebook. She put it in the inner pocket of her bag where she kept things she did not want to leave unattended. She stood up, straightened her jacket, and looked at the archive shelves around her, at the thousands of documents she had catalogued and stored and retrieved without anyone caring very much what she thought about any of them. Then she picked up her bag and walked out into the corridor. She had 7 days, and she was not, as it turned out, someone who could look at page 47 and choose to leave it blank. The corridor outside the archive was quiet at this time of morning. A single guard stood at the East Wing entrance 30 meters away, facing outward. A maintenance worker moved along the far wall, head down, pushing a trolley. A junior official walked past without looking at her. The palace moved around Myra Solon the way it always did, without noticing her, without adjusting for her, without acknowledging that she existed in the same space as everyone else. She had always understood this as a limitation. Standing in the corridor with a notebook full of evidence of something terrible and no obvious way to make anyone listen, she began, for the first time, to see it differently. No one was watching her. No one was tracking what she accessed, who she spoke to, which corridors she used. She could move through this building like a thought through a mind, present, purposeful, and entirely unseen. She had 6 more sets of records to pull before she was certain. She intended to pull them all. And when she had everything, when the picture was complete, when the shape of it was undeniable, she would find a way to make someone look at it who had the power to do something. She went back inside, sat down at her desk, and got to work. The notebook lay open on the desk in front of her, page 47 at the top of her vision. She did not need to reread it. She had already memorized every word. The first additional set of records she pulled was the staff access log for the service tunnels beneath the East Wing. Every person who entered or exited the tunnels was required to sign in and out at the access point near the East Maintenance stairwell. The log was a simple document, a grid of names and times, updated daily and archived weekly. She had catalogued dozens of them over the years, without ever reading them carefully. She read this one very carefully. In the 8 weeks before the current date, the service tunnel had been accessed 31 times. 27 of those accesses were by maintenance staff she recognized from the regular facilities schedule, names she had seen on inspection logs, duct cleaning reports, plumbing maintenance orders. 4 accesses did not correspond to any scheduled work she could find. 2 of the 4 were logged under the name of the Greywood Facilities contractor, on dates that fell within the same week as the incorrect filter replacement. The 3rd was logged under a name she did not recognize from any other document in the archive. The 4th was signed with initials only. She wrote all 4 entries down. Then she checked the signature on the 4th entry against every document she had access to that carried signatures. She found a match on the 3rd attempt. The initials appeared on a catering invoice, the same catering invoice for the dinner that had never taken place. The invoice was signed off by a minor court official whose name appeared in the staff registry, employed in the Budget Coordination Office, present in the building for the past 9 years. She had seen this name dozens of times on routine documents. It had never meant anything before. Now it sat on page 50 of her notebook and felt like a stone she had accidentally turned over in a garden, revealing something that had been living quietly in the dark underneath it. She closed the staff access log, replaced it on the correct shelf, and returned to her desk. Her hands were steady. She noticed this about herself the way a person notices the weather, as a fact, not a feeling. She was not shaking, she was not panicked. She felt, if anything, extremely focused, the way the archive room felt when she was in the middle of a complex cataloging task, and everything else in the world fell away except the work in front of her. This was, she supposed, the work in front of her now, only the stakes were somewhat larger than usual. She had 5 days left before the banquet. She had enough in her notebook already to form a picture that alarmed her deeply. But a picture was not proof, and she was aware with painful clarity that what she brought forward and how she brought it forward would determine whether anyone took it seriously. She needed to be precise. She needed to be complete. She needed to be impossible to dismiss. She picked up her pen, turned to page 51, and kept going. King Aldrich Voss had not asked for a glass of water in 7 years, without 2 guards moving at the same moment. This was not something he had requested. It was simply what happened. People moved when he moved, arranged themselves around him when he stopped, adjusted their behavior to the gravitational pull of his presence without being told to. He had understood from the age of 19, when he first took the throne, that this was the practical meaning of kingship, not the decisions you made or the authority you held, but the fact that the air in every room changed the moment you entered it. He found it exhausting in ways he did not discuss with anyone. On the Wednesday morning that Myra Solon was in the archive reading ventilation logs, Aldrich was in the North Conference Room listening to his defense minister, a man named Gregory Holt, explain the security arrangements for the upcoming state banquet. Gregory was 61 years old, had been defense minister for 11 years, and spoke with the particular confidence of someone who had been right about important things enough times to have stopped seriously entertaining the possibility that he might sometimes be wrong. The security arrangement for the banquet was, according to Gregory, thorough, comprehensive, and without meaningful gaps. Aldrich listened. He asked no questions. He had learned across 11 years of listening to Gregory that questions interrupted the flow of the briefing and that the briefing contained, somewhere near its end, the specific information he actually needed. He waited for it the way a person waits for a name they cannot quite remember, patiently, without forcing. The briefing ended. Gregory folded his notes and looked across the table with the expression of a man who considered his work finished. Aldrich thanked him and said nothing else. After Gregory left, Aldrich sat alone in the conference room for 4 minutes. His aide, a young man named Dorian Walsh, who had the valuable quality of understanding when silence was appropriate, stood near the door without moving. The 2 guards outside the room did not knock or enter. The palace gave him these 4 minutes of stillness as a matter of practiced routine, and he used them the way he always used them, to think about what had been said and what had not been said and what the gap between those 2 things meant. What had not been said was whether the security assessment had been independently reviewed. What had not been said was who had personally verified the contractor access logs. What had not been said was whether the East Wing ventilation checks, which he knew from a briefing 2 years ago had been flagged as a lower priority maintenance area, had been completed on schedule. He mentioned none of this to Gregory. Gregory would have answered each question with calm, complete, well-organized reassurance, and the reassurance would have been delivered with enough authority that the doubt would have felt irrational. This was another thing he had learned about Gregory over 11 years. He stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked back to his working rooms with Dorian beside him and 2 guards behind him. The corridor from the North Conference Room to the East Residential Wing passed, briefly, through the administrative section of the palace, where the archive was located. He walked past the archive door without looking at it. Aldrich Voss had grown up not in the palace but in the southern coastal region, the second son of a family whose name carried historical weight but little current wealth. He had been 12 years old when the designation assessors came to his town, and he had watched every child in his age group line up for classification with the particular anxiety of young people who understood, even then, that this moment would shape the course of their lives. He had stood in the line and been classified Alpha and had said nothing about it to anyone for 3 days, sitting with it privately, turning it over in his mind, understanding that from this point forward the world would look at him differently. He had not found this comforting. He had found it clarifying in the way that all large, irrevocable facts are clarifying. It told him exactly what the world expected him to be, which meant he could decide, consciously and deliberately, which of those expectations to meet and which to quietly discard. He had become king at 22 through a succession process that he would not describe to anyone in detail, because the detail was complicated, and the people involved were either dead or no longer speaking to him. What mattered was the result. He was here, he had been here for 11 years, and during those 11 years there had been 7 attempts to remove him by means other than a formal political process. 7 was a number he thought about more than he showed. The attempts had not made him fearful exactly. Fear suggested a kind of helplessness that he had not experienced since the age of 12, when he had first understood that the world was going to demand things of him whether he was ready or not, and that readiness was something you built, not something you waited for. What the 7 attempts had done was something different. They had made him precise, careful about detail in a way that other people sometimes read as coldness. Alert to gaps between what was said and what was actually known, in a way that Gregory Holt interpreted as excessive skepticism, and that his personal staff had learned to accommodate by simply telling him the truth. Dorian Walsh told him the truth. This was, in Aldrich's estimation, Dorian's most valuable quality, and the reason he had kept him on for 4 years when the average tenure of a king's personal aide in this palace was 18 months. Back in his working rooms, Aldrich sat at his desk and began moving through the morning's correspondence. It was routine work, responses to formal inquiries, approvals of administrative decisions that had already been made at lower levels and simply required his signature, the kind of paper that kept the kingdom running without requiring him to think very hard about any individual piece of it. He had developed over 11 years the ability to work through this kind of task quickly without letting it numb him entirely to what he was reading. Every 10 or 12 documents, something would catch his attention, and he would set the rest aside and focus on that one thing fully. Today it was a procurement update that flagged 2 new vendors added to the palace supplier registry in the past 8 weeks. The flag was routine, a standard notification that new vendors had been approved through the standard process. It required no action from him, it was simply informational. He read the 2 vendor names, Greywood Facilities, Orland Linen Supply, both registered in the past 2 months. Both had passed the standard vendor verification process. He moved the document to the side of his desk rather than the completed pile. He was not sure why. It was a small, instinctive thing, the kind of decision he had learned not to override. He left the document where it was and continued working. At midday he took a 30-minute break, walked the length of the East residential corridor twice, his version of exercise on days when the schedule did not allow for anything more, and returned to find that his lunch had been left on the side table. He ate standing at the window that looked out over the east garden, watching a groundskeeper move slowly along the gravel path below. He thought about Gregory Holt's briefing. He thought about the 2 vendor names. He thought about the state banquet in 6 days, and the seating arrangement that placed him at the head of the main table. Then he thought about Dorian and called for him. Dorian appeared in the doorway within 90 seconds. He was 31, methodical, with the slightly formal bearing of someone who had been trained in protocol but had quietly let most of the performance elements of it fall away. He carried a small leather folder, which he always had, in case Aldrich needed to dictate something immediately. Aldrich said the 2 new vendors in the procurement update, Greywood Facilities and the Linen Supplier, have someone pull their full registration documentation, not the summary, the full file. Dorian wrote this down. By when? Today. Dorian wrote that down too, anything specific to look for. Aldrich thought about this for a moment, the physical addresses and who approved the registrations. Dorian left, Aldrich turned back to the window. The groundskeeper had moved to the far end of the garden path and was now working near the east wall. From this height, the man was a small, steady figure, moving with the unhurried competence of someone who knew exactly what he was doing and why. Aldrich appreciated that quality wherever he found it. The afternoon was full. A meeting with the regional trade delegation at 2 o'clock, which ran long because the lead delegate was a man who believed that the length of his speeches was correlated with their effectiveness. A briefing from the Foreign Affairs Secretary at 4, which was efficient and useful. A review of the banquet guest list at 5, which was neither, because the guest list had already been finalized, and reviewing it was a formality that added nothing except the feeling that something had been checked. He signed off on the guest list and sent it back without comment. At 6:30, Dorian returned with a folder. Aldrich was at his desk. He took the folder without preamble and opened it. Inside were the full registration documents for both vendors. He read through them carefully. Greywood Facilities, registered 7 weeks ago, owner listed as 1 Gerald Finch, address in the Outer East District, a property description that matched a small commercial unit. Orland Linen Supply, registered 6 weeks ago, owner listed as Patrick Moore, address also in the Outer East District. He checked the approvals. Both had been signed off by a mid-level procurement officer in the Budget Coordination Office. He sat with this for a moment. Then he said, without looking up, "Do we have a property register for the Outer East District?" Dorian said, "Not directly. That would be a city records document. We could request it through the archive." "Do that tonight?" Aldrich looked up. "Is the archive open?" "The on-call archivist stays until 8. "Then yes, tonight." Dorian made a note and left. Aldrich looked at the folder for another moment, then set it beside the procurement update document he had placed on the side of his desk at midday. 2 pieces of paper side by side, neither of them alarming on its own. Neither of them doing what a piece of paper was supposed to do, which was to fit neatly into the larger picture and stay there without drawing the eye back to it. These 2 pieces kept drawing his eye back. He did not tell Gregory Holt about this. He did not tell the head of Palace Security, a capable man named Edgar Cole who managed a large team with genuine competence, and who would, if told that the king had a faint instinct about a vendor registration, take it seriously and conduct a thorough investigation that would, in all likelihood, turn up nothing and slightly embarrass everyone involved. He kept it to himself the way he kept most things, not as secrecy but as precision. He was not going to make noise about something he did not yet understand. He was going to find out more first, and then decide what the noise level warranted. At 7:55, Dorian returned with a single page from the city property register, delivered by the on-call archivist through the standard document request system. Aldrich read it. The address listed for Greywood Facilities in the Outer East District corresponded to a vacant commercial property, unoccupied for the past 14 months. He folded the page in half along its center crease. He set it on top of the folder. He looked at the wall across from his desk, at the place where a painting hung that he had never chosen and never removed, a landscape of the southern coast that someone had put there before he arrived, and that he had simply left because he could not think of a reason to take it down. Outside his window, the palace grounds had gone dark. The east garden was invisible now, just a rectangle of blackness below the lights of the east wing. Somewhere in that wing, in a room he passed every day without entering, someone had been reading documents today. He did not know this. He had no way of knowing this. He only knew what he had in front of him. 2 companies that did not exist the way they were supposed to exist, approved into the palace supply chain in a 2-month window, 6 days before the largest gathering his calendar would see this year. He was not afraid. He was precise. And precision, right now, told him that 6 days was not very much time. He called for Dorian again, this time not with the intent to assign a task but simply to have another person in the room. This was something he did rarely, and only when thinking required it. Dorian came and sat in the chair across from the desk and said nothing. He had worked for Aldrich long enough to know the difference between being summoned to take instruction and being summoned to occupy space while the king worked something out. Aldrich said, "Tell me what we know about the Budget Coordination Office." Dorian thought for a moment. Mid-sized department, 14 staff, handles procurement approvals below a certain financial threshold, run by a section head named Franklin Grove who has been there about 9 years. Below what threshold? Contracts under 15,000 marks go through their office without escalation. Aldrich nodded. The Greywood Facilities contract would have been positioned, he suspected, carefully below that line. Who signed the approvals? Both were signed by a staff member named Noel Bramley. He has been in the office for 9 years as well. The same duration. Aldrich filed that without comment. He thought about what he had: a vacant property, a missing maintenance worker. 2 vendors who appeared in the system within weeks of each other, both approved by the same person, both with connections to work done in or near the East Wing. He thought about the banquet. He thought about 6 days. Then he thought about all the ways he might be wrong. He had been wrong before. He had acted on instinct before and found nothing. He had organized responses to threats that turned out to be administrative errors, and in each of those cases, the embarrassment was real even if the danger had not been. He was a king, which meant his errors were visible in a way that other people's errors were not, and visibility was a particular kind of pressure. He considered the possibility that Greywood Facilities was a legitimately operating small business, whose proprietor had used a registration address that was no longer accurate. He considered the possibility that Noel Bramley approved contracts quickly because his workload was high and his attention was stretched. He considered all the benign explanations, laid them out in his mind with the same care he gave to the alarming ones, and measured them. The benign explanations were plausible. They were not, on balance, more convincing. He looked at Dorian. "In the morning, I want everything the archive holds on vendor contracts in the East Wing over the past year. All of it, not a summary, everything." Dorian wrote it down. "And I want the maintenance access records for the East Wing service tunnels, same period." Dorian wrote that down too. "Don't go through facilities," Aldrich said. "Go through the archive directly." Dorian looked up from his notes. This was, Aldrich knew, an unusual instruction. The standard process for records requests was to route through the relevant department. Going directly to the archive bypassed the departments whose records were being requested, which meant those departments would not know a review was underway. Dorian said only, "Understood." He made a small additional mark in his notes that Aldrich recognized as the notation for an instruction requiring discretion. Then he closed the folder and stood. "First thing in the morning?" Dorian asked. "First thing," Aldrich said. Dorian left. The room was quiet again. Aldrich sat for another minute, then stood, walked to the side table, poured a glass of water and drank it standing at the window. Outside, the palace grounds were fully dark now, lit only by the low path lamps along the garden walls. Somewhere beyond those walls, the city moved through its evening. Somewhere in this building, something was being prepared that he did not yet fully understand. He set the glass down and went to bed, not because he was not troubled, but because clarity came from sleep, and he needed clarity. He had 5 days and 23 hours until the banquet, and the difference between a king who responded to threats well and one who responded to them poorly was almost always preparation. He slept, and 600 meters away in the East Wing, Myra Solon was still at her desk, writing in her notebook by the light of a small lamp, filling page 53 with things she was not yet sure anyone would believe. Page 47 was running out of room. Myra had started a second notebook by Thursday evening, a plain one she had taken from the supply shelf in the archive back room, identical to the first. She had transferred her master timeline to the inside front cover in small, neat handwriting, the earliest anomaly date at the top, the banquet date at the bottom, and everything she had found between them arranged in chronological order on 12 lines. Looking at those 12 lines was like looking at a connect-the-dots picture that only had meaning when you saw the complete shape. And the shape was now visible. She had 5 days. The 6th set of records she pulled on Thursday was the East Wing Catering Corridor Access Log, a document that tracked entries to the service passages running between the palace kitchens and the East Dining Hall. This log was even simpler than the maintenance tunnel records, a plain sheet updated daily, initialed by the corridor supervisor at end of shift, filed weekly. It told her only who had used the corridor and when, but that was enough. In the 10 weeks before the current date, the name Greywood Facilities appeared in the corridor access log twice, not as a contractor for catering, not for any function listed in the event schedule. The log gave no reason for the visits, only the time in and time out. First visit 2 hours and 11 minutes, second visit 43 minutes. She wrote down both times. Then she went back to the catering invoices and found the entry for the dinner that had never taken place. The date of that invoice matched, within 1 day, the date of the first Greywood Facilities corridor visit. She stared at this for a long time. The pattern was fully visible now. Someone had used a false contractor registration to gain physical access to the East Wing service areas. They had done so on multiple occasions, over a period of approximately 2 months, and they had covered their presence with documentation that looked legitimate on first examination but failed under any careful cross-checking. The filter replacement carried a false signature. The vendor addresses were false. The catering invoice corresponded to an event that never existed. The corridor access was undocumented in any other record. This was not a coincidence. Multiple coincidences in the same direction, over the same period, pointing to the same location, were not coincidences anymore. They were intent. She picked up her pen and wrote at the top of the second notebook's first page, 5 days. Then she underlined it. The decision to report what she had found was, on the surface, obvious. Of course she would report it. Of course she would tell someone in authority, someone with the power to investigate and respond and act. That was the only sensible thing to do. She had evidence. The evidence pointed to something serious. She should tell someone immediately. The problem was that she had tried. On Thursday afternoon, before she pulled the catering corridor logs, she had taken her first notebook and walked to the office of Subcommander Ivan Wren, who oversaw East Wing security operations and whose name she knew from the guard rotation documents she catalogued regularly. She had knocked on his door. A staff member had shown her in. Ivan Wren was a large man, mid-50s, with the particular composure of someone who had managed security operations for long enough to believe that the management of security operations was a settled matter. He had listened to her. She was careful to say that. He did not interrupt her. He did not dismiss her while she was speaking. He let her lay out the sequence of anomalies she had found: the false contractor, the incorrect filter signature, the vacant property address, the catering invoice without a corresponding event. She spoke for approximately 6 minutes. She was concise and organized because concision was something she had trained herself toward, and organization was simply how her mind worked. When she finished, Ivan Wren looked at her across his desk for a moment. Then he said, "The archive is in the East Wing." She said, "Yes." He said, "Ventilation maintenance in the East Wing is handled by the facilities team. Vendor registration is handled by procurement. If there are irregularities in those areas, the correct process is to raise them with the relevant departments." She said she understood that. She said she was bringing the information to security because the irregularities clustered around the East Wing service tunnels and the approaching state banquet. He said, "Palace security does not take threat assessments from archivists." She looked at him for a moment, then she said, "Could it take a document review request from an archivist?" He said, "Submit it through the standard channel." The standard channel was a written request form that typically received a response within 10 working days. The banquet was in 5 days. She had thanked him, taken her notebook, and left. She did not cry in the corridor. She felt something that had a similar texture to hopelessness, but was, on examination, more like anger, and she was familiar enough with the difference to name it correctly. Hopelessness would have sent her back to the archive and made her close the notebook. Anger sent her to the supply shelf for a second notebook, and back to the records table to pull the catering corridor access logs. She tried Lieutenant Ada Fay on Friday morning. Ada Fay was 38, sharp-faced, efficient, and in charge of the West Wing daytime security rotation. She was not technically responsible for the East Wing, but she held a senior enough position that she had cross-wing authority in matters of palace-wide concern. Myra had chosen her because Ivan Wren had been immovable, and because Ada Fay had a reputation, according to the gossip that moved through the palace archive via the documents people left behind, of being practical above all things. Ada Fay heard her for 3 minutes before her expression shifted in a way that Myra recognized. It was not hostility. It was the slightly glazed patience of someone managing a conversation they had already internally decided was not worth their time. When Myra finished, Ada Fay said, "You've put together a very thorough analysis." Myra said, "Thank you." Ada Fay said, "The facilities and procurement irregularities you're describing are exactly the kind of thing that facility audits are designed to catch. There is a scheduled audit of East Wing maintenance contracts in the spring." Myra said, "The banquet is in 4 days." Ada Fay said, "I understand your concern. I would suggest submitting your findings to the facilities audit office and to the procurement review board. They will have it on record and can act if the evidence warrants." Myra said, With respect, neither of those offices can act before Saturday. Ada Faye looked at her for a moment with the particular expression of a senior person deciding whether to be patient or direct. She chose direct. I appreciate that you are concerned. The palace security apparatus is well equipped to manage banquet-level events. We have processes and expertise that go beyond what's visible from the archive. What you're describing, a series of document anomalies, is not actionable threat intelligence. Myra said, what would make it actionable? Ada Faye did not answer that question. She thanked Myra for her time and the conversation was over. Myra walked back to the archive, sat down at her desk and stayed very still for approximately 2 minutes. Then she opened the second notebook, turned to a fresh page and wrote 2 options. She listed them. Option 1, she had misread the evidence. The anomalies were genuine errors and coincidences. The banquet would proceed without incident, and she would have spent a week frightening herself with a connection that did not exist. Option 2, she had read the evidence correctly, and 2 senior security officers had declined to act on it because she was an archivist and an Omega, and the information had not come through the correct channel, and it did not match the way they had decided the world was organized. She considered both options with the same precision she brought to everything. She gave each one its full weight. She did not allow herself to privilege one over the other simply because one was frightening. Then she thought about the smell in the vent on Tuesday morning, the smell that had no business being there, the smell that had been her first, instinctive alert before any of the documents confirmed anything. She trusted the smell. She trusted it more than Ivan Wren's desk composure. She trusted it more than Ada Faye's patient dismissal. It was a physical fact, sensory and present, and she had been right to start pulling records because of it. She wrote at the bottom of the 2-option list, find someone who will look at what I have. The question was who? Going further up the security hierarchy meant going to Edgar Cole, the palace security chief, whose office was in the North Administrative Wing and who was, according to the internal directory she had access to through the archive catalog system, accessible by appointment with a standard wait of 3 to 5 working days. 3 to 5 working days. The banquet was in 4 days. She considered other routes. The defense minister was theoretically reachable but practically inaccessible to an archivist without a formal interdepartmental request. The Foreign Affairs Secretary had no security remit. The Budget Coordination Office was, based on her evidence, potentially compromised. The Catering Office was a logistical department with no investigative authority. She sat with the list she was building, looking at the gaps in it. Every route she could think of that operated within the normal structure of the palace ran either too slow or through channels that the people responsible for the problem controlled. There was one route she had not considered. She had not considered it because it was not a channel. It was not a process or a department or a procedure. It was a person, and the person was specifically the one person she had the least standing to approach directly. The king had a personal secretary, Dorian Walsh. According to the staff directory and the dozen documents that bore his name as a signatory or recipient that she had catalogued over the years, Dorian Walsh operated as the direct administrative link between the king's office and the rest of the palace. He was accessible through a request system that was separate from the standard interdepartmental process. The wait time for that system was not specified in any document she had found, which suggested it was discretionary rather than fixed. She looked at this option for a long time. Then she looked at the notebook in front of her, 2 notebooks now together. Every anomaly documented, every cross-reference checked, every date, every name, every false signature laid out in a sequence that a careful reader could follow from beginning to conclusion without needing her to explain it. She was a careful reader. She had built her entire working life on being a careful reader. She had produced something that any other careful reader could verify independently, without her voice, without her rank, without her classification. What she had was the documents. What the documents said was clear. If she could get them in front of someone who would read them with the attention they deserved, the evidence would speak for itself. She needed 4 days. She needed one person willing to read carefully. She had tried 2 channels. She had one option remaining that was genuinely outside the hierarchy she had already exhausted. She knew it was the most improbable path. She was also aware that she had no other one. She photographed every page of both notebooks with the small personal camera she kept in her desk drawer. She printed the images on the archive's document printer in the back room, labeled each print with its source document and date, and arranged them in order. She put them in a plain document envelope from the supply shelf. She addressed the envelope to Dorian Walsh, personal secretary to the King, North Administrative Wing, by hand. She held the envelope for a while. It was lighter than it should have been, given what it contained. She looked at her own name on the return address and thought about all the ways this could go wrong. The envelope left in a pile, the request dismissed as irregular, her position in the archive quietly reviewed for why an archivist was approaching the King's office directly. Then she put the envelope in her bag and went to work out the best route from the archive to the North Administrative Wing that would bring her past the fewest guards. She went home that night and did not sleep. She lay in the dark and went through both notebooks in her memory, page by page, checking that she had not misread anything, not overstated any connection, not given the evidence a shape it did not actually have. She had not, the shape was the shape, 4 days to the banquet, 14 anomalies. One conclusion. She got up before dawn, dressed, and went back to the palace early. She had one more set of records to check before she delivered the envelope, the event floor plan for the state banquet, which she had catalogued 3 weeks ago and which showed, among other details, the exact position of the head table relative to the East Dining Hall's service access points. She pulled the floor plan. The head table was 6 meters from the primary ventilation return above the service tunnel junction. She looked at this for a long time. Then she put the floor plan away, picked up her bag, and walked out of the archive with the envelope in her hand. The North Administrative Wing was not a part of the palace she had reason to visit in the ordinary course of her work. Her domain was the East Wing, its archive room, its maintenance corridors as they appeared in documents, its ventilation schedule as it existed on paper. The North Wing was where policy happened, where the senior staff operated, where the building's administrative weight was concentrated. Walking through it felt different. The floors were cleaner, the doors were heavier, the guards stood straighter. She counted 3 guards between the East Wing entrance and the North Administrative corridor. None of them stopped her. 2 of them did not look at her at all. The third glanced her way and looked back at the wall before she had passed him entirely. She was carrying a document envelope. Archive staff carried document envelopes all the time. There was nothing unusual about her presence. She was furniture, moving purposefully toward a destination. Dorian Walsh's office was on the 2nd level of the North Wing. She had found the room number in the staff directory. She took the stairs rather than the central corridor lift, because the corridor lift required a senior staff access badge to operate and she did not have one. The stairs were accessible to general palace staff, used mostly for maintenance and delivery purposes, and were accordingly empty at this hour. She came out on the 2nd level, found the door with the correct number, and knocked before she had time to think of a reason not to. A voice from inside said, "Come." She opened the door. The office was smaller than she had imagined, with a desk that occupied most of the available space and tall shelves along the opposite wall filled with organized files that she recognized, from professional instinct, as the same kind of operational records she worked with in the archive, but at a much higher level of sensitivity. Dorian Walsh was seated at the desk. He was younger than she had expected, perhaps 30, with a face that was neither warm nor cold, but simply attentive in a way that felt, immediately, like a different quality of attention than she had received from Ivan Wren or Ada Faye. He looked at her, he did not look through her. She said, "I am Myra Solon. I work in the East Wing archive. I am bringing this to you because I have found something in the palace records that I believe is serious, and I have not been able to get it heard through the standard channels." He said, "What kind of something?" She placed the envelope on his desk. "It would be faster if you read it." He looked at the envelope for a moment. Then he picked it up and opened it and began to read. Dorian Walsh read the way careful people read, without rushing, with his attention fully on the page in front of him. She watched him turn from the first page to the second, from the second to the third. His expression did not change significantly, but she saw his jaw settle slightly on the second page, the small physical signal of a person who has gone from reading to processing. He read for 11 minutes. She counted them, not by looking at the clock on his wall, but by counting her own slow breaths. When he set the last page down, he looked at her and said, "Sub-Commander Wren." "Tuesday afternoon," she said. "Lieutenant Faye." "Friday morning." He nodded once. Who else knows you have this? No one. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Wait here," and stood and left the room, carrying the envelope with him. The wait was longer than she expected, 38 minutes. She knew because she did eventually look at the clock. She sat in the chair across from his desk and kept her hands still in her lap and looked at the shelves along the far wall, reading the label tabs on the files without meaning to, the way she always read text that was in front of her. Event coordination. State correspondence, security protocols, budget review. She was looking at the budget review section when the door opened. She expected Dorian. The man who came through the door was not Dorian. He was considerably larger than Dorian, and the shirt he was wearing had no medals or insignia on it, and his face, when he looked at her, held an expression she had not expected at all. She had prepared herself for authority. She had prepared herself for skepticism or dismissal. She had prepared herself for the long, assessing look of someone deciding whether she was credible or simply anxious. She had not prepared herself for the expression of a person who was genuinely, quietly, completely paying attention to her specifically. He said, "You are the archivist." She said, "Yes." He said, "Sit down." She had already been sitting, so she stayed where she was. He sat in Dorian's chair across from her and placed the envelope on the desk between them. He looked at it for a moment, then at her. He said, "Walk me through it from the beginning." And she did. The moment the door opened, Myra understood that she had underestimated what would happen next. She had carried a version of this meeting in her mind for 2 days. In that version, she would deliver her documentation to Dorian Walsh. Dorian Walsh would review it. Dorian Walsh would escalate it through whatever process his role gave him access to, and someone further up the chain would investigate and act. She had planned for a process. She had not planned for a person to walk through the door and sit down and ask her to explain herself directly, with no intermediary, no protocol buffer, no administrator between her and whatever was about to happen. The man across the desk looked at her with total focus, not the unfocused sweep of someone performing attention, actual attention, the kind that comes from people who have learned that incomplete information is more dangerous than no information, and who therefore listen as though every word has weight. She told him everything in the order she had documented it. She did not use the notebooks directly. She had the sequence memorized, and reciting it from memory felt more precise than reading, because memory filtered out the hesitations and the uncertainties she had felt while writing. She told him about the smell on Tuesday. She told him about the incorrect filter replacement and the guard's signature from someone who had been on leave. She told him about Greywood Facilities and the vacant property. She told him about the catering invoice for the dinner that never happened. She told him about the budget coordination office and the approval signature. She told him about the East Wing Service Tunnel access log and the 2 Greywood visits. She told him about the banquet floor plan and the head table position. He did not interrupt her. He did not reach for the documents in the envelope between them. He listened. When she finished, the room was quiet for approximately 7 seconds. She counted them. Then he said, "You went to Ivan Wren. Tuesday afternoon. He told you to submit a request through the standard channel." "Yes, and Ada Faye. Friday morning, she suggested the facilities audit office. And then you came here." "Yes, He looked at the envelope, not at her for once, at the envelope, as though recalibrating around something. Then he said, "The smell in the duct, you said it reminded you of an overheated lamp." "Before it caught fire," she said, "it has that specific dry quality, electrical almost but not quite." "Have you described it to anyone else?" "No. There was no one who would have taken it seriously." He looked up from the envelope and back at her. "I would have taken it seriously." She said nothing because she did not know him, and she had no answer for that. He opened the envelope then, for the first time since entering the room, and looked through the photographs she had made of her notebook pages. He looked at them in the same way he had listened to her, one at a time, completely, moving forward only when he was finished with the previous one. He took 9 minutes. She counted those 2. Then he said, "Do you have any hypothesis about the specific nature of the threat? Not inference, hypothesis." She had thought about this. She had thought about it carefully, because she was aware that the difference between documented evidence and personal theory was the difference between something that could be independently verified and something that lived only inside her own understanding. She had kept the two categories separated in her mind throughout. She said, the evidence shows deliberate, unauthorized access to the East Wing service areas over a period of approximately 2 months, connected to false documentation, and at least one compromised approval in the Budget Coordination Office. The specific technical nature of what was placed or prepared in those areas is not something I can determine from documents alone. What I can say is that the timing, the location, and the pattern of concealment are consistent with preparation for something designed to affect the banquet. He said, "What is your assessment of Noel Bramley, the approval signatory?" This was a precise question. She appreciated it. Based on the documentation, he is either complicit or he approved the contracts without adequate verification. The 9-year tenure matches the contractor who appears in the tunnel logs, but tenure alone is not proof of anything. He nodded, then he said something she had not expected. "You cross-referenced the catering corridor access log against the event schedule yourself." "Yes, sir." "That log is not normally part of the archive catalog. It is a facilities department document. It becomes an archive document when it is filed at end of week. I pulled 3 weeks of it simultaneously." "Is that within your access level?" She looked at him steadily. "Facilities documents filed in the archive are open access for archive staff. I was within my access." He held her gaze for a moment, and then something changed slightly in his expression. Not a smile, more the settling of something. She could not name it exactly. She recognized it, though, because she had felt the same thing herself at various points in the past 5 days. The moment when the evidence stops being a question and becomes a conclusion. He stood, he took the envelope, he said, "This room is not where we stop." She stood too. "What happens now?" He said, "Now I act on what you have given me." He paused at the door. "You will remain in the archive for the rest of today. You will not access any additional documents related to this matter. You will not speak to anyone about what you have found or what you have done this morning. Is that understood?" She said, "Yes." He said, "Good." He held the door open for a moment. "You did the right thing." She left. She walked back through the North Administrative Wing, down the stairs, through the East Corridor and into the archive room. She sat at her desk. The room was exactly as she had left it. Her pending work was in the same pile. Her pens were in the same cup. The archive smelled of paper and old binding, and the faint dusty warmth of the overhead lights, the way it always smelled. She opened her current cataloging task, a new batch of land registry updates, and began to work. Her hands were completely steady. After Dorian Walsh returned to his office 20 minutes after the king left and found the archivist's chair empty, he stood at his desk for a moment reviewing what had just happened. He had worked for Aldrich Voss for 4 years. He had seen him manage crises, receive bad news, handle unexpected intelligence reports, respond to the 7 events that were now simply numbered in the files as attempts 1 through 7. He had never, in 4 years, seen the king leave a meeting in the middle of it without telling him where he was going. He had opened the office door, found Myra Solon waiting and the room otherwise empty, and understood from the quality of her stillness that whatever she was carrying was not something he should ask her about directly before knowing more. He had read the envelope. He had gone directly to the king. The king had gone directly to the archivist. The sequence had taken 23 minutes, and in that time something had shifted in the palace that was not yet visible to anyone in it. A piece of information had moved from a place where it had no power to act on the world into a place where it did. Dorian had worked in proximity to consequential decisions for long enough to know what that shift felt like when it happened. It felt like this, the specific quiet that precedes movement. He sat at his desk and opened his own working log. There was a great deal to do, and he would need to do it without making the kind of noise that would alert the wrong people. He had a list of resources he could draw on discreetly. He had contacts in the security directorate who were not connected to the East Wing operation. He had, above all, a king who was now in motion with very specific information and the authority to act on it. Dorian made 4 notes. Then he began making calls through the internal line, each one short and carefully worded, each one to a person he had selected based on the single criterion he considered most important in the next 3 days, that they would do exactly what they were told and tell no one who had told them. Meanwhile, in the room below, Edgar Cole, the palace security chief, was completing his second routine briefing of the day, satisfied that preparations for Saturday's banquet were fully on track. He did not know that above his head, the ground had shifted. He would not know until he needed to. That was, Dorian thought, the nature of the work that was now underway. It did not announce itself, it did not make noise. It moved through the palace the way water moves through stone, quietly, persistently, and without requiring permission. The same way, he thought, that a woman in a document envelope had just changed the course of a Saturday. Down in the archive, Myra Solon turned a page in the land registry batch and noted a discrepancy in a boundary description that she would have flagged in any other week without a second thought. She flagged it now. Some things did not change because larger things were also happening. The registry discrepancy existed regardless of the banquet. The land in question had a real boundary whether or not Myra Solon had spent the past 5 days reading ventilation logs. She noted it, filed a query form, placed it in the outgoing pile. She worked steadily until lunchtime. She ate at her desk. She went back to the land registry. At 3 in the afternoon, a guard she did not recognize came to the archive door, knocked, and told her that her building access pass had been upgraded effective immediately, and that she would find the updated card at the security desk near the East Wing entrance. He said nothing else. He left. She sat for a moment with this information, then she went back to the land registry. At 5 o'clock she closed her current task, organized her desk, put on her coat and walked to the East Wing security desk. The guard on duty, a woman named Claire who had been at that post for as long as Myra had been at the archive and who had never once initiated a conversation with her, looked up when she approached, opened a drawer and produced a new access card without being asked. Myra looked at the card. It had her name on it, her photograph from the staff registry, and a small colored stripe along the bottom edge that she had never seen on an archive staff card before. She recognized the stripe. She had cataloged enough security documents to know what it meant. It was a senior administrative access designation. She put the card in her wallet, thanked Claire, and walked out of the building. The evening air was cooler than usual for this time of year, and she stood for a moment on the staff entrance steps, breathing it in. 3 days to the banquet. One person had read what she had written. Whatever happened now was not hers to control. She had done what she could do. She had built the evidence and carried it somewhere it could be used. The rest was in other hands, larger hands, hands with authority and resources she did not have. She walked home in the early dark, and for the first time in 5 days, she did not mentally review her notebook on the way. She ate dinner alone, the way she usually ate dinner, at the small table by the window of her apartment that looked out over the street below. The street was ordinary, a few people walking home late, a delivery cart moving slowly past, the warm light of the bakery on the corner that stayed open until 7 every evening. She watched it without thinking about it particularly. She thought about the man who had sat across Dorian's desk from her. She had recognized him, not from personal experience but from documents. In 4 years of cataloging palace records, she had processed hundreds of papers bearing his name. Royal decrees, administrative orders, formal correspondence, security directives, state agreements. The name Aldrich Voss appeared on all of them in the same way, at the top or at the bottom with a signature beneath it, always with a weight that other names did not carry, a documentary gravity that she had noted in the abstract professionally, the way she noted other things that were simply true about the material she worked with. In the room, in person, the weight was different. It was not the authority that surprised her. She had expected authority. What she had not expected was the quality of focus. The way he had listened to her as though her words were pieces of evidence he was fitting together as she spoke, not evaluating whether they were credible but determining what they implied. Most people, in her experience, listened to information in order to decide whether or not to believe it. He had listened in order to understand what it meant and what to do about it. That was a different kind of attention entirely, and she had spent 5 days desperately needing someone who could do that. She washed her dishes, put them away, and sat for a while with a cup of tea she let go cold, turning the new access card in her fingers. Senior Administrative Access. She had not asked for it. It had simply appeared, delivered by a guard she didn't know, because someone with the authority to change things had changed something. Just like that. Without a form, without a 10-day wait, without the 37 procedural steps that would normally stand between a request and a result. She put the card on the table beside her cooling tea. She looked at it. She thought, this is what it is to have someone on the other side. She had spent her adult life operating alone in the space between what she knew and what anyone with authority was willing to hear. She had learned to work within that space efficiently, to find the edges of it and press against them without expecting the wall to move. The wall had always been there. Omega Archivist, East Wing, correct channel. Standard wait time, relevant departments. The wall had moved today. Not because she had pushed harder, not because she had found a more persuasive argument or a more receptive audience or a better channel. It had moved because someone had looked at her evidence with the attention it deserved and understood immediately what needed to happen. The documentation was the same documentation she had shown Ivan Wren. The evidence was the same evidence she had laid out for Ada Faye. What was different was the person reading it. She thought about this for a long time. Then she washed her teacup, turned off the light, and went to bed. She slept for the first time in nearly a week, without reviewing her notebooks. The next morning, she arrived at the archive at her usual time. The East Wing was normal, the overnight guard doing his end-of-shift notes at the corridor desk, the early maintenance crew moving through with cleaning equipment, the administrative staff arriving in ones and twos through the main entrance. She let herself into the archive with her key, the old key, not the new card, which was for a different level of access, and sat at her desk and resumed the land registry batch. At 9 in the morning, Dorian Walsh came to the archive room. She had not expected this. He knocked, which was unusual. Most people who came to the archive simply opened the door, because it was a service room and service rooms were not places where formality was generally observed. She looked up when he knocked. He opened the door at her acknowledgement and stood in the doorway with his folder and his slightly formal bearing, and said, "The matter you brought to my attention yesterday." She said, "Yes." He said, "Things are in motion. You don't need to take any further action." She said, "I understand." He seemed to consider something for a moment. Then he said, "There are some additional questions that may need to be answered over the next 2 days. About the specific documents you cross-referenced and the access logs you pulled. Is it possible for you to remain available?" She said, "I am here every day." He said, "I mean available beyond regular hours if necessary." She looked at him carefully. "Yes," she said, "I can do that." He nodded. He almost said something else. She could see it in the slight pause before he closed the conversation, the small half-formed thing that he decided to leave unsaid. Instead he said, "Thank you," and left. She returned to the land registry. The registry discrepancy from the previous afternoon had been picked up by the query system and returned with a note from the Boundary Survey Office explaining that it was a transcription error from the original 1987 survey and would be corrected in the next update cycle. She logged the response, marked the file resolved, and moved to the next batch item. 2 days, she had 2 days before the banquet. Whatever was in motion was not something she could see from where she sat. She could only sit and work and wait, and trust that the evidence she had built was in the right hands now. She had done the documentation, someone else had the authority. That division she thought was the right division. She had stayed in her lane, the lane had mattered. She turned a page and kept working. Outside the archive, in corridors she could not see, the palace was shifting in ways that would not be visible until Saturday evening. Small changes, quiet movements, a security review initiated here, a discreet cross-check conducted there. A ghost contractor whose registration was quietly frozen. A staff member from the Budget Coordination Office who received, without explanation, a request to attend a meeting in the North Administrative Wing the following morning. None of it made noise. None of it disrupted the surface of the palace, which continued to function in its usual way. Loud, formal, hierarchical, full of people managing their status and their schedules and their impressions of each other. Underneath the surface, something was being carefully, methodically dismantled. Myra Solon catalogued land registry documents and did not know any of this specifically. She only knew what she had known for 5 days, that she had found something real, that it was now in motion, and that Saturday would answer everything. 2 days felt like a long time. 2 days felt like no time at all. The man from Greywood Facilities was named Owen Strayed, and he had been in the palace service tunnels 11 times over the course of 8 weeks. Aldrich Voss was looking at this number on a report that Dorian had placed on his desk on Friday morning, 40 hours before the banquet. Owen Strayed, 37 years old, former municipal utilities technician, no criminal record, no known political affiliations. 2 addresses in the registry, the vacant commercial property under the Greywood name and a residential address in the Eastern Residential District that was, when cross-checked against the city property database overnight, an active lease. A real person living in a real place who had constructed a false professional identity and used it to gain repeated access to the interior of the palace. The report was 2 pages long. Dorian had prepared it with the help of 2 people from the Security Directorate who were not connected to the East Wing operations team, selected on the criterion that had governed every move Aldrich had made in the past 18 hours. Keep the circle small until you know where the opening is. The opening in this case was Noel Bramley. Noel Bramley worked in the Budget Coordination Office. He had worked there for 9 years. He had, according to the report, approved 6 contracts for vendors with incomplete or unverifiable documentation in the past 14 months. 2 of those contracts were recent, Greywood Facilities and Orland Linen Supply. The other 4 were older and appeared on first review to be lower value and unrelated to the East Wing. Appeared was the operative word. Aldrich had instructed Dorian to have all 6 reviewed before the end of Friday. The Orland Linen Supply contract was particularly interesting. Aldrich had flagged it originally when he saw the Outer East District registration. The company's contract covered linen delivery to the residential East Wing laundry service, which meant it had a legitimate recurring reason to be present in the East Corridor. Its most recent delivery was scheduled for Saturday morning, 4 hours before the banquet guests began to arrive. He had instructed that delivery to be held. He did this quietly through a facilities scheduling adjustment that would look, to anyone watching the normal administrative flow, like a routine laundry service rescheduling. He did not suspend the company's contract. He did not flag Noel Bramley's office. He did not contact the facilities team or the Security Directorate's main operations center. He rescheduled a linen delivery, and the adjustment was logged by an administrative assistant who processed 17 similar adjustments on an average day and thought nothing of it. The people responsible for what was coming did not yet know he knew. This was the only advantage he had, and he intended to use it for exactly as long as it remained useful, which he estimated was somewhere between 12 and 18 more hours. At 10 on Friday morning, Aldrich met with Edgar Cole. Edgar Cole was a careful and competent man who ran a large security operation with genuine professionalism, and who had not been told about any of what Aldrich had learned in the past 2 days. The meeting was framed as a standard pre-event briefing review, a common practice before large palace events, unremarkable in its occurrence. Edgar Cole came in with his briefing folder and his organized confidence and his 11 years of experience managing events exactly like this one. Aldrich let him speak for 20 minutes. He asked 3 questions, all of which were within the normal scope of a routine review. He said nothing about Greywood Facilities, Owen Strade, Noel Bramley, or the East Wing service tunnels. After Edgar Cole left, Aldrich stood at the window of his working room for 10 minutes. He was not keeping Edgar Cole out of the picture because he did not trust him. He was keeping him out of the picture because trust was not the variable that mattered here. What mattered was containment. The people behind Owen Strade, and there were people behind Owen Strade, this was not the work of a single utilities technician acting alone, had placed at least one point of access inside the palace administrative structure. If that one point was Noel Bramley, then Bramley might alert his contacts the moment he sensed that anyone was looking at the contracts he had approved. If there were other points of access Aldrich had not yet identified, and there might be, the archivist's notebook was thorough, but it could not account for what she had not had reason to look at, then additional points might do the same. Every person told was a surface through which information could leak. Aldrich was therefore telling almost no one. Dorian, 2 members of the Security Directorate whose records he had personally reviewed, a retired officer named George Hay who had run covert security operations before Edgar Cole's tenure, and who owed Aldrich a significant personal debt that Aldrich had never called in until now. These 4 people were executing the response that Aldrich had mapped out on Thursday night, after leaving the archivist's borrowed chair and returning to his working room, and sitting with the full weight of what he had just heard for long enough that the shape of it was clear. The shape required speed and silence in equal measure. He had 1 day. George Hay's team entered the East Wing service tunnels on Friday evening, during the 2-hour window between the close of the afternoon maintenance shift and the beginning of the overnight security patrol. They were dressed as a routine overnight inspection crew. No one stopped them or questioned them, because they had a correctly issued maintenance order, signed by a facilities supervisor who had been told only that there was a routine inspection, and that it was to be logged as such. They were inside the tunnel for 4 hours. What they found there was not something Aldrich would discuss in detail with anyone outside the specific group of people who needed to know it. The technical documentation was prepared by George Hayes' team and delivered to him on Saturday morning, 2 hours before the banquet preparation was scheduled to begin. He read it in the same way he read everything, completely from the beginning without skipping. Then he locked it in the secure drawer of his desk and put the key in his jacket pocket. The device that had been installed in the ventilation junction beneath the east dining hall was designed to release a gas compound through the primary return system during peak occupancy of the event above. The timing mechanism was connected to the banquet schedule. The release would have been triggered at the point in the evening when the largest number of guests were seated, and the ventilation system was running at its highest capacity. At that concentration, in that space with those occupancy numbers, the effect would have been rapid and comprehensive. George Hay had deactivated it. His team had photographed it, documented it, and left it in place for the additional 2 hours it took to run a trace on the activation mechanism and identify the remote signal pathway. Then they had removed it. 3 people were identified through the signal pathway and the contractor documentation over the course of Friday night. Owen Strayed, Noel Bramley from the Budget Coordination Office, and a third individual whose name Aldrich read on Saturday morning and recognized, with a particular kind of cold clarity, as someone who had attended every state banquet for the past 9 years, and whose presence at this one had already been confirmed on the guest list. His name was Gerald Finch. He was 54 years old, a minor court official in the Administrative Services Department, present in the palace for a decade, unremarkable to everyone who had ever worked near him. He was also, according to the registration documents for Greywood Facilities, its listed owner. Aldrich had not known this until Friday night, because the Greywood registration had used a variation of the name, G. Finch, without a first name, and the cross-reference between that registration and the full staff directory had not been run until George Hayes' team completed the contractor trace. The archivist's notebook had flagged the registration as suspicious. It had not had the additional access required to connect it to a specific individual in the palace directory. That was not a flaw in her work. It was a limit of what she had available to her, and she had been precise about what she could and could not determine from the documents alone. She had said a compromised approval in the Budget Coordination Office. She had named Noel Bramley only as a possibility, not a certainty. She had been correct about both. She had said, the evidence is consistent with preparation for something designed to affect the banquet. She had been correct about that too. She had said all of this from an East Wing archive room, with general access documents in 5 days alone. Aldrich stood at his window on Saturday morning with the technical report in his locked drawer and the trace findings in his jacket pocket, and the banquet 8 hours away. And he thought about what it meant that the person who had found all of this had been dismissed by 2 senior security officers as not worth listening to. He thought about that specific thing for a while. Then he called Dorian. When Dorian came in, Aldrich said, "Ivan Wren." Dorian said, "Yes." "Ada Faye?" Dorian said, "Yes." Aldrich said, "I want their employment reviews on my desk before the banquet." Dorian wrote this down without comment. Aldrich said, "What is the archivist doing today?" Dorian said, "She is in the archive. She came in at her usual time." Aldrich nodded. He looked at the wall where the painting of the southern coast hung, the one he had never chosen and never removed. He had grown up near that coast. He knew what it looked like in reality, rougher than the painting suggested, colder, the kind of shoreline that did not accommodate carelessness. The painting softened it into something decorative. He thought, for no reason he could immediately explain, that the archivist would have preferred the real coast to the painting. He said, "After the banquet, I want to speak with her." Dorian wrote that down too. Outside the palace, the morning was clear. The city was going about its Saturday. The banquet was 8 hours away, and the device that had been intended to make it the last gathering of its kind was sitting, deactivated, in a sealed evidence case in the basement of George Hayes' operational office. 3 people were in quiet custody. 3 more were being watched. The palace did not know any of this. The banquet preparation team was setting tables, arranging flowers, testing the service corridor lighting, preparing the kitchen schedule. Guests would arrive at 7. The king would be seated at 8. The evening would proceed. It would be an ordinary banquet. It would be, in fact, the most ordinary banquet Aldrich Voss had attended in 11 years, which was exactly what it was supposed to be, and exactly what it would now be, because a woman in an East Wing archive room had noticed a smell in a duct on a Tuesday morning and had not let it go. He put on his jacket. He had a full day ahead of him. There were guests to receive, a country to run, 11 years of practice in looking untroubled in public when he was not untroubled at all. He walked out of his working room and into the day. The morning moved with the unhurried rhythm of a large institution preparing for something it had done many times before. Banquet preparation at the palace was a known quantity, the same sequence of tasks, the same departments checking in with each other at the same intervals, the same controlled intensity that never quite escalated to visible anxiety because everyone involved had done this often enough to know exactly what they were responsible for and when. Myra Solon was not part of any of it. She was in the archive working. The land registry batch was finished. She had moved on to a set of diplomatic correspondence updates that had arrived Thursday and needed to be catalogued and filed. It was routine work, careful work, the kind of work that kept her hands busy while her mind did something else. Her mind was doing the math she had been doing since Wednesday. 3 people in custody as of Saturday morning, she did not know this. 6 people being watched, she did not know this either. She only knew what she had been told, which was that things were in motion and that she should not take any further independent action. She had not taken any. She had come to work at her usual time and done her usual job, and somewhere between not sleeping for 5 days and sleeping properly for 2, the texture of the waiting had changed from active to passive. Not because the danger had passed, she did not know whether it had passed, but because she had handed it over, and handing things over was a skill she had learned the hard way. Once it was in the right hands, you had to trust the hands. She trusted these hands, she realized, more than she had expected to. She catalogued the 3rd diplomatic update and moved to the 4th. At 11 in the morning, Dorian Walsh came to the archive again. He knocked again, which she had now decided was simply how he operated. She looked up. He said, "The situation in the East Wing service area has been fully addressed." She said, "Addressed?" He said, "Resolved. You don't need to carry it anymore." She looked at him for a moment. She was not sure what she felt. Something that had been tightly coiled in her chest for a week did not quite release, but loosened, the way a rope loosens when the tension comes off one end. She said, "Was I right?" He said, "Yes." She nodded once and looked back at the diplomatic correspondence in front of her. He said, "The king will want to speak with you after the banquet this evening." She looked up again. "After this evening, yes. I will send someone for you at the appropriate time." She said, "I will be here." He said, "You don't need to wait in the archive. You are not required to be on duty this evening." She said, "I will wait here." He seemed to understand this. He nodded and left. She turned back to the 4th diplomatic update. The morning gave way to afternoon. The archive was quiet in the way it was always quiet on Saturdays, when the administrative staff were not at their desks, and the corridor outside had a lower, slower foot traffic than on weekdays. She ate her lunch at her desk, as always. She made herself a cup of tea from the small kettle in the back room that she had brought from home 2 years ago because the communal kitchen on the main floor required too much social navigation. She sat at her desk with the tea and looked at the shelves around her. 4 years of work here. 4 years of cataloging and filing and cross-referencing and building a system so efficient that it had become invisible, the way very good systems always become invisible. You stop seeing the organization because everything is simply where it is supposed to be. She had done that here. She had made this room work better than it had worked before, and no one had noticed, and she had not minded. She minded slightly more now, sitting with the tea and thinking about Ivan Wren's desk composure and Ada Faye's patient dismissal, than she had minded a week ago. She was not sure that was wrong. Something that had been very quiet in her for a long time had gotten slightly louder in the past 5 days. She was not sure yet what to do with that. She put the tea down, opened the 5th diplomatic update and kept working. The afternoon light through the archive's high window shifted from bright to the softer gold of early evening. She heard the distant sound of the palace beginning to prepare for guests, a change in the quality of the corridor sounds, a different rhythm of movement, the particular controlled energy of an event approaching. She stayed at her desk. At 7:15, the banquet began. She did not know this specifically. She knew it was approximately 7 because the light through the window had gone from gold to the beginning of dark, and the palace sounds from the direction of the dining hall had taken on the quality of an event underway rather than an event being prepared. She had been to the archive window once, briefly, to look out at the east garden in the last of the evening light, and had seen the courtyard below filled with the parked carriages and vehicles of arriving guests. She went back to her desk. She thought about the head table, 6 meters from the ventilation return. She thought about the floor plan she had pulled and put away. She thought about the smell on Tuesday morning, the smell she had trusted, the smell that had started everything. She thought about a man holding his coffee cup with both hands in the early light of a North Wing office. She turned to a new page in her current working log and picked up her pen and wrote the date at the top. Then she put the pen down and looked at the door and waited for whatever came next. The banquet was, by all visible accounts, a success. Gerald Finch arrived at 6:45, which was earlier than most guests and precisely what Aldrich had anticipated. A man who had spent 9 years building access and positioning himself at the center of a plan did not arrive late to its final act. He walked through the main entrance of the East Dining Hall, accepted a welcome drink from a tray, and moved through the pre-dinner gathering with the practiced ease of someone entirely at home in these rooms. He was being watched by 3 people whose primary skill was watching without being visible while they did it. George Hay had selected them from a very short list of individuals he trusted with tasks that required absolute discretion and no improvisation. They were not palace guards. They were not in uniform. They occupied 3 positions in the room: a member of the catering service staff, a guest's personal assistant who had been quietly briefed and was cooperating without knowing why, and a maintenance technician in the corridor outside. That together gave a complete view of Gerald Finch's movements throughout the evening. He did not look alarmed. He moved through the room, spoke with other guests, took his assigned seat at a table in the middle section of the hall, 3 rows back from the head table. He ordered his food. He accepted wine. He appeared to be, in every outward respect, a man attending an event he had been to 9 times before and would attend again. He would not attend again. Aldrich was at the head table. He had been at the head table for the past 11 banquets, and he moved through the seating and the greeting and the opening formalities with the kind of ease that 11 years of practice produces. Not comfort exactly, but competence so deep it resembled comfort. He spoke with the guests to his left and his right. He ate the first course. He listened to the deputy trade minister make a comment about grain yields that required a response, and he gave one. He signed an administrative document that Dorian had quietly placed beside his plate between courses, because there was never, in a king's schedule, a moment that was entirely free of something requiring a signature. He did not look toward the middle section of the dining hall. He did not need to. George Hay had a channel of communication that ran through the event staff and updated him every 20 minutes with a brief status signal. The signal was simple: a particular arrangement of items on the serving cart nearest the king's end of the head table. If the arrangement was unchanged, everything was proceeding as planned. If it changed in a specific way, something had shifted and Aldrich would need to act. The arrangement did not change through the first course or the second. He ate and spoke and nodded, and managed the evening the way he managed everything, with the surface running smoothly over a great deal of internal attention. In the service corridor outside the East Dining Hall, Owen Strade had arrived at 6:30, before the guests began entering. He carried an identification document issued by Greywood Facilities and a work order for a routine ventilation check that appeared on its face to be legitimate. He presented these at the service entrance. The guard on duty, a member of George Hay's team, accepted the documents, checked them against a clipboard, and told him the check had been rescheduled to after the event, in accordance with standard noise restriction protocols during palace functions. Owen Strade had not expected this. He stood for a moment at the service entrance, and the guard watched his face with the particular attention of someone trained to read a person's response to unexpected information. What the guard saw was not confusion. What he saw was calculation, quick and barely visible, the micro-expression of a man whose plan had just encountered a variable it had not accounted for. The guard said, "If you want to wait in the support staging area, the team usually clears the corridor within an hour of the event ending. Owen Strayed said he would wait. He was in the staging area for 11 minutes before he was approached, very quietly, by two individuals who had been in the staging area before he arrived. The staging area visit was his last as a free person. Noel Bramley had not come to the banquet. He was not on the guest list, had never been on the guest list, and had spent the past 18 hours in the careful, deliberate grip of a situation he had not anticipated and was not equipped to manage. He had been contacted on Friday evening by the senior procurement officer above him in the budget coordination chain, a contact that appeared routine and administrative on its surface, and that Noel Bramley had attended without suspicion. The person waiting for him in that meeting was not the procurement officer. The conversation that followed was the kind of conversation that experienced people had with less experienced people who needed to understand, quickly and clearly, the full extent of what they had done and the specific options available to them now. It took 40 minutes. By the end of it, Noel Bramley had provided everything he knew about how the contract approvals had been arranged, who had approached him, what he had been told about their purpose, and how long he had been involved. He had been involved for 14 months. The 4 older contracts that had first appeared as a low-value anomaly in Aldrich's review were not unrelated to the East Wing operation. They were practice. They were the trial run of a system designed to see whether a person in Bramley's position could be used as a reliable gateway for false contractor documentation. The answer, apparently, had been yes. Aldrich read this information on Saturday morning in the technical summary George Hay had prepared. He read the section about the 4 older contracts and felt a specific measured anger that he had trained himself over 11 years to hold without expressing. He was angry at the system that had allowed this to develop over 14 months without triggering any review. He was angry at the gap between what the palace believed its security protocols could detect and what they had actually failed to detect. He was angry in a way that was useful because it was specific. It told him exactly what needed to change and where. He did not allow himself to be angry in ways that were not useful. He had found this to be, over 11 years, one of the more important disciplines of the job. The banquet moved through its 3rd course. The arrangement on the serving cart near the head table remained unchanged. Gerald Finch ate his dinner 3 rows back and appeared, to all observation, to be waiting for something that was not coming. He checked the time twice between the 3rd and 4th courses, a small movement that one of the 3 watchers noted in his mental log. He spoke less after the 3rd course than he had before it. He drank water where he had previously been drinking wine. He was waiting for a signal that his mechanism was running. The mechanism had been removed from the tunnel 48 hours ago. No signal was coming. It took Gerald Finch until the dessert course to understand that something had gone wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not in the way that produced visible panic, quietly wrong. The kind of wrongness you feel before you can name it, when the plan that was supposed to be executing is producing no evidence of its execution, and the people who were supposed to confirm its progress are not available, and the environment around you is entirely normal when it should not be entirely normal. He set his dessert fork down, he looked at the room, he looked at the head table. The king was speaking with the guest to his right, a regional administrator who had been talking about water management policy for 7 minutes. The king appeared to be listening with genuine interest. Gerald Finch looked at his fork, he looked at his plate, he took a slow breath, he reached for his water glass with a very steady hand. He had spent 9 years in this palace. He knew how to be still when stillness was the only remaining option. He drank his water, he waited for dessert to end. He made the calculations available to him, what he knew, what had likely been discovered, what the timing of that discovery meant for the next several hours, and reached a conclusion that most people would not have reached as quickly or as calmly. He was a practical man. The plan had failed. The failure had been anticipated by someone, which meant the someone was very capable or had received very specific information. Either way, the event was over. He would leave normally at the end of the evening with the other guests without calling attention to his departure. He would return home, collect what he needed, and be out of the city before dawn. He had a route planned. He had planned it months ago because he was, above all things, a man who understood the value of the exit strategy. He was still thinking about the exit strategy when the dessert plates were cleared and the evening formally concluded, and the guests began to stand and move toward the hall. He rose with them. He said good night to the people at his table. He moved toward the main doors with the easy, unhurried pace of a man who had just had an enjoyable evening. At the main doors, two people he had never seen before fell into step on either side of him, so naturally and smoothly that no one nearby would have noticed anything unusual. One of them said very quietly, "This way, please." He said nothing, there was nothing useful to say. He went the way he was directed, away from the main exit through a side corridor, into a room where two additional people were waiting. The door closed. Outside, the guests continued to leave. The East Dining Hall staff began clearing the tables. The evening ran to its close without disturbance, without incident, without any of the 312 people in attendance having any reason to believe that the event had been anything other than what it appeared. It appeared to be a perfectly ordinary banquet. In the archive room 600 meters away, Myra Solon heard the distant sound of the evening concluding, the change in corridor foot traffic, the rise and then fall of voices, the particular quality of an event ending. She looked at the clock on her desk, 10:43. She had been in the archive for 15 hours. She was not tired in the way she had expected to be. She was alert in the specific way that comes after long tension, clear-edged, slightly raw, awake in a way that was less comfortable than sleep but more present. She looked at the door. At 11 o'clock there was a knock. The knock came in the same way that Dorian Walsh knocked, with formality, with restraint, with the implication that the person on the other side could choose not to answer if they wished. She stood up and opened the door. It was not Dorian. She recognized the man in the corridor, which was a new experience. The first time she had seen him had been in a North Wing office with no time to adjust to the reality of who was standing across from her. Now she had had 48 hours with the knowledge, and she used those 48 hours to simply look at him without the urgent need to manage what she was feeling about the situation. He was wearing a jacket that looked like it had been put on in the last few minutes, the slightly unsettled look of formal clothes removed and replaced quickly. His face was, as before, attentive, not performing attentiveness, simply being it. He said, "The banquet is finished." She said, "I know, I could hear the end of it." He said, "May I come in?" She stepped back from the doorway. He came into the archive, which was, she was briefly and irrelevantly aware, very small compared to the spaces he normally occupied. The shelves full of documents, the central desk, the two chairs, the small kettle on the side table she had brought from home 2 years ago. He did not seem to notice the smallness. He looked at the shelves the way she had noticed he looked at things, as though the information in them was of actual interest. He said, looking at the shelves, "All of this." She said, "Since my first week." He turned to look at her. "You read all of it." "The cataloging requires a degree of reading. I read more thoroughly than the catalog requires." A pause, then why? She considered this. It was a straightforward question, and it deserved a straightforward answer. She said, "Because knowledge is the only resource I have in this building that isn't dependent on my rank or my classification." He looked at her for a moment after that, not the assessing look of someone deciding whether to believe her, the look of a person who has been given an answer they are going to keep. He said, "It was there, in the tunnel, what you thought was there." She had already known this, in the abstract sense that Dorian had said it was resolved, but hearing it said directly, in plain words, with the specificity of someone who had seen the documentation, that was different. She felt something settle in her chest, not relief exactly, but the particular sensation of a thing that has been held with great tension finally being held by the correct mechanism. She said, "I was certain by Friday morning." He said, "I was certain by Friday afternoon." She looked at him, "What made you certain?" He said, "The vacant property address. I had your documentation, and I also had a request pending with the archive for the city property register. When the result came back and matched your finding, that was the point at which I stopped considering alternative explanations." She nodded slowly. He had run his own parallel checks, independent verification using the same sources she had used. This was, she thought, the only responsible thing to do with information you received from an unknown source. He had not simply taken her word for it, he had confirmed it himself. She respected this considerably. She said, "The people responsible." He said, "In hand, all three." She did not ask for names. It was not her place to know, and she was not sure she wanted to. What mattered was the fact, and the fact was settled. She said, Ivan Wren told me that Palace Security does not take threat assessments from archivists. He said, Ivan Wren no longer works in Palace Security. She said nothing. She had not expected that, or perhaps she had, in the part of her that had written 2 notebooks and walked to the North Wing alone and stood in front of 2 dismissive officers without flinching. He said, Ada Faye has been reassigned to a role without security oversight. She still said nothing. He said, I want to make sure I understand what happened so that I can prevent it from happening again. 2 senior officers received actionable threat intelligence and declined to act on it because of who delivered it. Yes, she said. That is a system failure, he said. Not only theirs, mine. The system I run produced 2 officers who categorized the credibility of information based on the rank and designation of the person delivering it, rather than on the content and the evidence. She thought about this. That is how most systems work. I know, he said. That is what I intend to change. There was a quality to this statement that was not a promise to her specifically. It was a statement of intention toward a problem he had identified, delivered in her presence because her presence was the reason the problem had become undeniable. She understood the difference. She did not need it to be a promise to her to take it seriously. She said, What will you do? He said, Change how threat intelligence is received and routed. Remove the automatic credibility filter that corresponds to rank and designation. Build a way for people in your position, people with significant access and relevant knowledge, and no pathway to be heard, to have a pathway. She said, That is a significant structural change. He said, Yes. She said, Will it happen? He looked at her, Do you have a reason to think it won't? She thought about this carefully. She said, No, I have a reason to think it will be difficult. He said, Most things worth doing are. She looked at him for a moment, then she said, The device in the tunnel. Was it specifically intended to affect the head table? He was quiet for a beat, then the entire room. But yes, the positioning was specifically relative to the head table concentration. She looked at the floor for a moment, 6 meters. The number had been fixed in her mind since she pulled the floor plan. She had spent 3 days holding the distance between the table and the vent as an abstraction, a number on a blueprint. It was different now to hear it confirmed in the past tense. She said, I noticed the smell on a Tuesday. He said, 9 days before the banquet. Yes. He said, You wrote it down. Page 47, 3rd line. He said very quietly, And you did not let it go. She looked up at him, No. He said nothing for a moment. The archive was very quiet around them, the way it was always quiet at night. The particular thick stillness of a room full of paper and old information, absorbing sound, holding it. The overhead light was warm and slightly yellow. Outside the single high window, the palace grounds were dark. He said, I owe you a debt. She said, You don't. He said, I do, and I am not someone who carries debts without addressing them. She said, Then address it by building the pathway. He looked at her, something in his expression shifted, and she recognized the shift. It was the same thing she had seen in Dorian's office, the settling of something that had been in motion, a conclusion reached, a decision made. He said, I also intend to address it directly. Your role in the archive will not remain what it was. She said, I like the archive. He said, You can keep the archive, I want to add to it. She said, Add what? He said, Access, proximity, the ability to notice things that matter and have a route to report them that does not require you to knock on the door of my secretary alone at 9 in the morning with a document envelope because every other door has been closed to you. She looked at him. She was aware of many things at once. The size of the room, the lateness of the hour, the fact that she had been awake for an extraordinarily long time, the fact that this conversation was the most directly consequential she had ever been part of in her life. She was also aware that he was waiting for her response with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, which meant he was actually interested in what she would say. She said, I would like to know what I would be reporting to. He said, Me. She said, That is direct. He said, I find it more efficient. She thought about this for a moment, then she said, I will need to stay in the archive. The cataloging system I built, is not one anyone else can operate without a significant learning period. He said, agreed. She said, I will need unrestricted document access for both wings, not just the East. He said, done. She said, and I will need it understood formally that what I bring forward will be treated as evidence regardless of where it comes from. He said, that is what I just committed to change. She looked at him for a long moment. She was looking at a man who had arrived in her borrowed archive chair with 11 years of a kingdom on his shoulders, and had looked at her as though she were a person worth looking at, and had been the first person in this building to do that, and had then acted on what she gave him with a speed and precision that had saved the people in the hall tonight, and who was standing in her archive at 11 o'clock on a Saturday night having this conversation instead of the many other things he could be doing. She said, all right. He nodded, then he said something she did not expect. He said, what is on page 47, the first 2 lines? She looked at him carefully. Why? He said, because you mentioned the 3rd line specifically. I want to know what came before it. She said, the first line is a date, the second is a reference to a weather report I was cross-checking at the time. Neither is relevant. He said, you memorized both. I memorized the entire notebook. He said nothing. He looked at her in the way she was becoming, if not accustomed to, at least less surprised by, as though the fact she had just stated was interesting information about the world that he was going to keep. He said good night. He left. The archive door closed, and the room was quiet again, and Myra Solon stood in the middle of it for a moment before sitting back down at her desk. The pending work in her cataloging queue was still there, the land registry batch completed, the diplomatic correspondence 5 items remaining. She looked at the clock, almost midnight. She pulled the 6th diplomatic update toward her, picked up her pen and started to read. Some things she had found did not change because larger things were also happening. The documents were still here, the archive was still here, and tomorrow morning she would come back to it the same as every other morning and do the work that needed doing. Only now there would be a different pathway for what she noticed when she did. She turned to page 1 of the 6th diplomatic update and began to read. The week after the banquet moved through the palace at 2 speeds simultaneously. On the surface, it was an ordinary week. Administrative business resumed its normal rhythm on Monday morning. Reports were filed, meetings were held, the diplomatic correspondence that had been waiting during the banquet preparation period was processed and answered. The East Wing moved through its daily routines without apparent disruption. The maintenance crew cleaned the dining hall on Sunday morning and found nothing unusual, because there was nothing unusual to find. The guest list from Saturday evening produced, in the days that followed, the usual quantity of thank you correspondence, and the usual 2 or 3 requests for follow-up meetings from people who had spoken with someone interesting and wanted to continue the conversation. The banquet had been, by all visible accounts, a success. Beneath the surface, the week was something else entirely. George Hay completed his full technical documentation on Sunday and delivered it to Aldrich in a sealed file that joined the other sealed files in the drawer with the key. Edgar Cole was briefed on Monday morning, privately, in a meeting that lasted 1 hour and 40 minutes. Aldrich was precise in what he shared and how he shared it, because Edgar Cole was a professional and deserved precision, and because the failures in the run-up to the banquet were failures of system design rather than individual judgment, and Aldrich was careful not to frame them otherwise. Edgar Cole listened to the full briefing without interrupting. His face went through several expressions in a very compressed period. At the end, he was very still for approximately 30 seconds, the stillness of a man processing a significant recalibration of his understanding of the past 2 weeks. Then he said, I should have had this information on Tuesday. Aldrich said, yes. Edgar Cole said, my officers received it on Tuesday and Wednesday and did not pass it up. Aldrich said, yes. A long pause, then Edgar Cole said, I want to conduct the internal review of those decisions myself. Aldrich said, I want you to, but the structural change I'm implementing is not contingent on the review, it happens regardless. Edgar Cole said, understood. He paused. The archivist, she built the entire picture from general access documents. Aldrich said, in 5 days. Edgar Cole was quiet for a moment. Then he said, with the flat honesty of a professional who had just encountered something that genuinely surprised him, "I did not know we had that in the archive." Aldrich said, "We didn't, she built it." Edgar Cole left with his briefing folder and his recalibrated understanding, and Aldrich turned to the next item on the morning's agenda, which was a meeting with the trade delegation he had postponed from the previous week. The meeting was productive. The trade delegation had specific concerns about the northern grain quota that were legitimate and required a response. He gave them one. He signed 3 documents before noon. He ate lunch at his desk, a habit he had developed in the second year of his tenure, when the social requirements of formal lunches began to cost more time than they returned in value. At 2 in the afternoon, he looked at the document in the center of his desk. It was a single page. He had drafted it himself on Sunday evening, which was unusual. Most formal documents of this kind went through the protocol office for language review before they reached his desk for signature. He had written this one himself because the protocol office's language, in his experience, reduced precision in the service of formality, and he wanted this document to be precise. It was an expansion of Myra Solin's archive position, effective immediately. It outlined in plain language the following: an upgrade in her security clearance to senior administrative level, already informally in effect since Saturday, the extension of her document access to all palace wings without departmental limitation, an additional reporting line connected directly to his office through a designated secure channel, and a formal acknowledgement, in the language of the document itself, that the holder of this position had provided intelligence that was accurate, timely, and critical to the safety of the palace and its occupants. The last clause was his own. The protocol office would have removed it, on the grounds that formal position documents did not typically contain retrospective acknowledgments of the kind. He left it in. He signed the document. He asked Dorian to see that it was delivered to the archive by end of day. Dorian delivered it himself. This was also unusual. He had sent documents to the archive dozens of times through the standard courier system and had never once delivered one in person. He recognized this as a departure from his normal operating pattern and did not examine the departure too closely. Myra Solin was at her desk when he arrived. She looked up when he knocked, and he came in and placed the document on her desk and stood back. She read it without picking it up. She read it twice, which told him something about her level of focus. Then she looked up at him. She said, "The last clause." He said, "Yes." She said, "That is not standard protocol language." He said, "No." She looked back at the document. He waited. She said, "He drafted this himself." Dorian said, "How do you know?" She said, "The phrasing in the 3rd paragraph is identical to how he speaks. Protocol office language uses passive constructions. This one doesn't." Dorian thought about this. He had noticed the same thing and had assumed it was simply an oversight in the review process. He revised this assumption now. He said, "Will you have questions about any of the specifics?" She said, "The secure channel, how does it work?" He said, "I will explain the details separately. The channel is separate from the standard archive routing." She said, "And the document access extension, does that require a physical upgrade to my access card, or is it handled through the registry?" He said, "Both. The registry change is already in effect. The card upgrade will be handled by the security desk." She nodded. She looked at the document for a moment more. Then she said, "Tell him I read the last clause twice." Dorian said, "I will." He left. He walked back through the corridor with the slight adjustment in his understanding of the situation that had been happening gradually over the past 4 days. He had worked for Aldrich Voss for 4 years, and he had a well-developed sense of the space between what Aldrich did and what he was doing it for. He was good at reading the operational rationale underneath decisions without needing it explained. What he was reading now was slightly different from operational rationale. It had the same precision, the same deliberateness, but it pointed in a direction that was less about palace security and more about a person specifically. He did not ask about this. It was not his place to ask, and more practically, it was not something that Aldrich would clarify even if asked. He would simply continue to do what he was doing, with the same care and the same precision, and Dorian would continue to support it with the same discretion that had made him useful for 4 years. He made a note to explain the secure channel protocol to the archivist on Tuesday morning. On Monday evening, Myra sat in her apartment and read the document again. She had brought a copy home, which she was technically entitled to do now that it was her own position document. She read the last clause several more times. She was not a person who had ever received formal acknowledgement of work she had done, and she was in the process of discovering that formal acknowledgement, when it came in precise and unperformed language from a source she had come to understand was precise and unperformed in everything, landed differently than she had imagined it would. She set the document on the table beside the access card. Two objects side by side, representing a shift in her situation that she had not been looking for and had not imagined when she knelt on the archive floor on a Tuesday morning and pressed a loose panel back into place with both palms. She looked at them for a while. Then she made dinner, ate it at the window, and went to bed at a reasonable hour for the first time in 10 days. She slept well. On Tuesday, she came to work and Dorian Walsh arrived at 9 to explain the secure channel protocol, which was straightforward and well-designed, and she noted 3 questions about it that she asked him at the end of his explanation, and he answered all 3. Then he left and she went back to the diplomatic correspondence that she had now been working on for a week without finishing, because larger events had interrupted the routine. She finished it on Tuesday afternoon. She filed the last item, updated the catalog, and sat back in her chair. The archive was quiet. The shelves were exactly as they had been on Monday morning last week, when she had knelt between row 7 and pressed a loose floor panel back into place and noticed a smell. The same documents, the same organized silence, the same high window with the same strip of sky above it. Different in the ways that mattered. She pulled the incoming tray toward her. A new batch of administrative records had arrived from the Budget Coordination Office. She paused, looking at the origin stamp on the batch. The Budget Coordination Office, under its new interim section head, installed on Monday morning after Noel Bramley's extended leave of absence was formalized in the administrative log. She began to work through the batch. On the second document in, she noticed an anomaly in a vendor renewal form. A supplier whose registration date did not align with the procurement cycle that should have generated the renewal. It was small. It might be nothing. It was the kind of thing that could be a timing error in the system, a data entry mistake, an administrative lag. It was also the kind of thing she wrote down. She opened her notebook. Not the one with pages 47 through 53 that was now in the secure evidence file in the North Wing. The new one started this week. She opened it to the first page and wrote the date at the top, and then she wrote what she had found, and she noted the vendor name and the renewal form reference and the discrepancy in dates. Then she picked up the next document in the batch and kept reading. This was the work. This was always the work. The palace ran on documents, and documents told the truth if you read them carefully enough, and she was very good at reading carefully. She had been good at it for 4 years quietly without anyone knowing. Now someone knew. Now there was a channel for it and an acknowledgement of it, and a clause in a formal document that said, in precise and unperformed language, that what she did had mattered. She turned to the next page. Something on the third document caught her eye. She read it twice. She wrote it down on the second line of the first page of the new notebook. Outside the high window, the sky was doing what it always did, moving slowly from one shade to another, indifferent to everything happening below it, impartial and clear. She kept reading. She had always kept reading. The difference from now was that the reading had somewhere to go. The third document in the budget coordination batch was a cross-departmental payment authorization for services rendered by a company she did not recognize. The company name was Belford Technical Services. She checked it against the vendor registry she had updated 2 weeks ago. Belford Technical Services did not appear. She checked the prior year's registry. Belford Technical Services did not appear in that one either. She wrote this down on line 2 of the new notebook. Then she wrote line 3, not in registry. Services rendered. What services? She pulled the payment authorization forward and read it carefully. The services description was vague: equipment calibration and technical support, East Residential Wing. The amount was within the threshold that went through budget coordination without escalation. The approval signature was the interim section head, which meant it had been signed off in the past 2 days, which meant it had entered the system after the previous section head's departure. She read this 3 times. She was not going to do what she had done last time. She was not going to spend 5 days building a complete picture alone before telling anyone. That was what the channel was for. The channel existed precisely so that the distance between noticing something and having it reach someone who could act on it was not measured in days and dismissed requests. She photographed the payment authorization with the small camera in her desk drawer. She wrote a brief summary on a clean sheet of paper: company name, date, amount, approval, service description, absence from vendor registry for minimum 2 years. She noted that the amount fell below the escalation threshold. She noted the timing relative to the change in section head. She placed the summary and the photograph in an envelope, sealed it, and wrote Dorian Walsh's name on the outside. She walked to the East Wing entrance, showed her upgraded card to the guard, and asked the guard to have the envelope delivered to the personal secretary's office in the North Wing. The guard took the envelope without comment. She walked back to the archive and resumed the batch. The envelope was on Dorian Walsh's desk by 3 in the afternoon. He read the summary, he read it again. He made a call, brief and quiet, through the internal line. Then he carried the envelope and the summary to the working rooms at the end of the North Wing corridor. Aldrich was at his desk, reviewing a foreign policy brief. Dorian placed the envelope on the corner of the desk without interrupting the review. Aldrich glanced at it, read the exterior annotation, Dorian's handwriting, but not in his usual notation style, which meant the content was unscheduled and came from outside the normal daily flow, and set the policy brief aside. He read the summary, he looked at the payment authorization photograph, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Today." Dorian said, "This afternoon's batch from budget coordination." Aldrich said, "The interim section head has been in the role for 2 days." Dorian said, "Yes." Aldrich looked at the payment authorization photograph again. Either she moved very quickly on something already in the pipeline, or someone moved something through while the transition created cover. Dorian said, "That was my reading." Aldrich said, "Find out which." He handed the envelope back to Dorian, "And tell the archivist she was right to send it today." Dorian left. Aldrich looked at the corner of the desk where the envelope had been. He thought about the timing. Budget coordination had just undergone a significant change. A new section head was reviewing a backlog, learning the system, establishing routines. It was the most predictable period of organizational vulnerability, the gap between the old guard and the new, when neither fully had their eye on everything. Someone had known to use that gap. That someone either had access to information about the internal change or was embedded enough in the institution to recognize the opportunity without being told about it directly. He thought about what the archivist had said to him in her archive room on Saturday night. The system produced 2 officers who categorized the credibility of information based on rank and designation rather than content. He had agreed with her. He had said it was a system failure and that he intended to change it. He was now, 4 days later, receiving a properly channeled, precisely documented anomaly flag from the same source, routed through the correct process, in time to act on it the same day it was identified. The process worked. He was aware that the process working in this specific instance was not separable from the person the process worked with. The process had a channel. The channel was useful because the person at the other end of it was thorough, precise, did not flag things she was not confident in, and had demonstrated over the past 10 days a level of analytical accuracy that was rare in any setting. He had told her he wanted to speak with her after the banquet. He had told her he would address the debt he owed her. He had told her role would change, and that he wanted her to report to him directly. He had done all of these things because they were right, and because the situation required them. He was becoming aware quietly that there was something else happening alongside those decisions. It was not urgent. It was not pressing. It was the kind of small, slow awareness that builds in the background of a life that does not normally produce much of it, and which he recognized as something worth noting precisely because it was unexpected and therefore informative. He did not act on it. He returned to the foreign policy brief. At 4:30, Dorian came back with the result of the Belford Technical Services check. The company was registered in the city records under a different name, Belford Systems and Calibration, that appeared in the vendor registry under that full name with a 2-year history. The payment authorization had used an abbreviated name that did not match the registry record. This had created a false appearance of absence from the registry. Whether this was a deliberate obfuscation or an administrative shortening of the name was, Dorian said, not yet clear. The service description was also vague enough that it did not definitively confirm or deny legitimate intent. Aldrich said, "What is the approval chain for equipment calibration work in the residential wing?" Dorian said, "Facilities, not procurement. A budget coordination payment authorization for a facilities service is outside the standard routing." Aldrich said, "So the payment is structured incorrectly regardless of whether the company is legitimate." Dorian said, "Yes." Aldrich said, "Have Edgar Cole's team verify the actual calibration work. If the work was done, by whom and when. If it wasn't, I want to know what the authorization was actually for." Dorian wrote this down, then he said, "Should I inform the archivist of the outcome?" Aldrich looked up. "Keep her informed. She flagged it. She should know what it produced." Dorian said, "Understood." Aldrich said, "And tell her not through the formal channel. Directly, come to the archive and tell her." Dorian made a note. He was getting a clearer picture of the instruction, and he noted it in the same part of his professional awareness, where he noted other things that were relevant to his role without requiring comment. He went to the archive at 5 o'clock, before the end of the working day, and found Myra Solon cataloging the last items in the batch. He told her about Belford systems and calibration and the name discrepancy and the incorrect routing of the payment authorization. He told her that Edgar Cole's team were now verifying the actual work. He told her it was not yet conclusive, but it was being followed immediately. She listened, asked 2 precise questions about the routing discrepancy, and received 2 answers. Then she said, "Thank you for coming directly." He said, "The king's instruction." She said, "I know," a small pause, "thank him." Dorian said, "I will." He turned to go, then stopped. "He said to tell you that you were right to send it today." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted slightly, barely visible, the equivalent in stillness of something in motion. She said, "I know I was." Dorian considered this, then he said, "Good," and left. He walked back through the east corridor to the north wing, thinking about the word that the archivist had used. Not "thank you" or "I am glad" or even "I was hoping he would say that." Just "I know." The confidence of someone who had learned the hard way and repeatedly to trust their own assessment before anyone confirmed it. The particular self-possession of a person who had been dismissed enough times to understand that external validation was useful but not necessary. He thought about what it had taken to arrive at that self-possession. He thought about the 5 days she had spent alone with 2 notebooks, and the knowledge that she was right and no clear route to make anyone listen. He thought these things and then set them aside, because they were not part of his immediate professional responsibilities, and went back to his desk. At 6 o'clock, the Belford verification came back through Edgar Cole's team. The calibration work had been completed. It was legitimate work, done by a legitimate company, billed under a shortened name that did not match the registry record precisely, but was, according to the company's own invoicing practice, their standard short-form usage. The anomaly was real, the underlying activity was not. Dorian carried this result to Aldrich, who received it, noted it, and filed it as a false positive, a genuine anomaly in the documentation that turned out to have a benign explanation. He asked Dorian to have the Budget Coordination Office update their vendor name matching protocol to require exact registry matches on all payment authorizations. Then he said, "Tell the archivist the result." Dorian said it was a false alarm. Aldrich said, "Tell her the result, she flagged something real." The explanation was benign. Both things are true and she should know both. Dorian went back to the archive. Myra was putting on her coat when he arrived. He told her the verification result. She listened, she nodded. She said, "The name discrepancy in the payment authorization is still an incorrect practice regardless of whether the company is legitimate. It should be fixed." Dorian said, "It's being fixed. Budget coordination is updating the protocol." She said, "Good." She picked up her bag, "So this one was nothing." He said, "This one was nothing." She said, "That is also useful information." She said, "Good evening," and left. Dorian stood in the empty archive for a moment, looking at the shelves, at the organized silence that she had built and maintained and worked in for 4 years without anyone noticing. Then he turned off the light and closed the door behind him. Outside, Myra Solon walked home through the early evening air, not reviewing any notebook, not running any timeline in her head. The result had been nothing, and that was useful information, and tomorrow there would be more documents, and some of them would contain things that mattered and some of them would not, and she would read all of them with equal care because that was how you told the difference. The city moved around her, indifferent and ordinary. She was not indifferent, she was not ordinary. And she was, for the first time in 4 years, in a position where neither of those things needed to be invisible. She walked home in the early dark, and the city did what it always did, moved around her without noticing. But she was not moving through it the same way she had been a week ago. Some things once changed did not change back. 3 months after the banquet, the kingdom changed how it listened. The formal policy document was 6 pages long, written by Edgar Cole with Dorian Walsh's review and Aldrich's signature at the bottom. It established, for the first time in the palace's operational history, a confidential intelligence intake channel accessible to staff below senior administrative level. It required that every report received through this channel be reviewed by a designated officer within 48 hours, regardless of the source's rank or designation. It required that the review officer produce a written assessment and that the assessment be filed independently of the originating officer's judgment. The document did not mention Myra Solon by name. It did not need to. Everyone in the senior staff who read it understood with varying degrees of specificity what had prompted it. Edgar Cole had spent the first week after his Monday morning briefing in a state of controlled professional recalibration. He was not a man who made excuses. He was the kind of man who looked at a system failure and immediately began redesigning the system, because failure that was not analyzed was failure that would repeat. He analyzed it. He found what he had not wanted to find, that his security operation had a significant and uncorrected bias toward discounting intelligence from non-traditional sources, and that this bias had been present in the culture of the operation long enough to be invisible to the people inside it. This was not comfortable information. He sat with it for a week. Then he redesigned the intake system, requested Aldrich's authorization for the policy change, and implemented it. Ivan Wren and Ada Faye were in reassigned positions. Their files were updated with the specific notation that their decisions in the week before the banquet had been reviewed and found to be procedurally deficient. This was dry language. It was also the language that followed a person through their professional records, and both of them understood exactly what it meant for their careers. Myra learned about the policy document from Dorian on a Wednesday in early winter, 3 months after the banquet. He came to the archive as he had come every 2 weeks since the banquet, as part of the routine they had established for the reporting channel, a brief meeting to review what she had flagged in the intervening period, what had been followed up, and what the results had been. In 3 months, she had flagged 11 things. 9 had been benign, document irregularities that had innocent explanations, administrative errors, 1 case of a staff member falsifying their training log to avoid a recertification, which was a personnel matter rather than a security one, and was handled by the Human Resources Office. 2 had not been benign. The first non-benign flag had come in the 6th week, a vendor contract in the West Wing maintenance schedule whose approval trail showed the same structural pattern as the pre-banquet contracts she had identified originally. A new company, registered recently, approved by a single officer below the escalation threshold. Edgar Cole's team had investigated and found that the vendor was linked to a person whose name appeared in the documentation from the banquet plot investigations. They had not found a device or an active plan. They had found the beginning of a preparation, and they had stopped it before it moved beyond preparation. The person responsible was no longer in the country. The investigation was ongoing. The second non-benign flag had come 3 weeks later, an anomaly in the guard rotation documentation for the North Residential Wing that suggested a gap in overnight coverage on a specific date. The gap turned out to be the result of a scheduling error, but the investigation required to confirm it as an error rather than an intentional gap had revealed a broader pattern of rotation documentation issues that Edgar Cole's team subsequently corrected across the entire palace rotation system. Neither of these outcomes was dramatic in the visible sense. No one was arrested in front of witnesses. No alarm was raised in a public corridor. The work that Myra did and the work it generated moved through the palace's invisible mechanisms and produced results that were never announced and rarely visible. This was, she had decided, exactly right. She did not want visibility, she did not want credit. She wanted the things she noticed to have somewhere to go and something to do when they arrived there, and for the past 3 months, that was exactly what had happened. Dorian told her about the policy document on Wednesday. He described it, gave her the reference number, told her it was in the active policy registry, and that she could pull a copy through the archive if she chose. She said, "Did he write the last clause himself?" Dorian said, "Which clause?" She said, "Whichever one is the one that didn't come from Edgar Cole or the protocol office." Dorian was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "The requirement that the reviewing officer's written assessment be filed independently of the originating officer's judgment. That is the mechanism that prevents an Ivan Wren from suppressing the review." She said, "That clause?" He said, "Yes." She looked at the policy reference number she had written on the edge of her working pad. She would pull the document today. She would read all 6 pages carefully, because she read everything carefully, and because this document was, among other things, about her. Dorian left. She got up from her desk and walked to the filing registry, pulled up the policy catalog and located the document. She printed a copy and brought it back to her desk. She read all 6 pages. The language was careful and formal throughout, except for one sentence in the 4th section, which read, "The reviewing officer shall treat all incoming reports as primary source intelligence until independent analysis determines otherwise, regardless of the source's position within the institutional hierarchy." The rest of the 4th section was Edgar Cole's language. That sentence was not. She read it twice, then she turned the page and kept reading. The week after Dorian's visit, Aldrich came to the archive. He had not come to the archive since the night of the banquet. Their communication since then had been through the channel, her flags, Dorian's briefings, the occasional additional question from Aldrich relayed through Dorian when something she had flagged required clarification. The channel was working. The channel was the appropriate mechanism. He did not disrupt the mechanism by adding unnecessary personal visits. He came anyway, on a Thursday morning in early winter, at 9:15, when she was in the middle of a new batch of Crosswing administrative records that had arrived the previous day. He knocked, she said, "Come in." He came in and sat in the visitor's chair that had always been in the archive but that no one had, until 3 months ago, used in her presence. She looked at him. He looked, as he always looked, like someone who had a great deal of other things to do and had chosen to be here instead. He said, "I want to ask you something." She said, "All right." He said, "The first flag you sent after the policy change. The West Wing vendor contract, you sent it on the same day you identified it." She said, "Yes." He said, "Not the following day, not after additional cross-referencing, the same day." She said, "The structural pattern was clear. Additional cross-referencing would have confirmed what I already knew. The value of the additional time was lower than the value of the additional speed." He said, "That judgment call took you a week to arrive at with the banquet." She said, "I had no channel with the banquet. I needed to be certain enough to overcome the barrier. With the channel, the threshold is different." He looked at her. "The threshold is different or you are different." She thought about this. It was a precise question and it deserved a precise answer. She said, "Both." He nodded slowly. This appeared to be the answer he had come to hear, though she did not fully understand why until he said, "I want to formalize the role further, not just the channel, your function." She said, "In what way?" He said, "A named role, a defined scope, documented authority to pull documents across all departments without requiring departmental approval, a salary adjustment to reflect what you actually do." She said, "I still want the archive." He said, "The archive is the base. The role expands from it." She looked at him for a moment. The morning light through the high window came in at a low angle this time of year, and it caught the edge of the desk between them in a way that made the ordinary surface look briefly like something more considered. She noticed this and then returned her attention to him. She said, "What would the role be called?" He said, "I have not named it yet. I was going to ask what you thought." She blinked. She had not expected that. She said, "You want me to name my own position?" He said, "You know better than anyone what it does." She thought about it, she thought about the notebooks, the pages, the smell in the vent, the 5 days alone, the channel that now connected what she found to somewhere it could go. She said, "Institutional reader." He looked at her, "Say more." She said, "Every institution generates documents that tell the truth about what is happening inside it, but most institutions are not reading their own documents carefully. Someone needs to read them, not to audit compliance, not to check boxes, to read them the way you read a person's face, for what they are actually saying underneath what they appear to be saying." He said, "Institutional reader." She said, "Or something with more weight in the formal language, but that is the function." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "Chief Document Intelligence Officer." She said, "That is too many words." He said, "The protocol office will not accept 2 words for a senior role." She said, "Then use their words, the function is what matters." He said, "Agreed." He stood, "Dorian will have the paperwork by next week." She said, "I will have questions about the salary adjustment." He said, "Dorian can answer them." She said, "Dorian will give me the protocol office number. I want a conversation." He looked at her, "With me." She said, "You offered the role. You should be able to explain the compensation structure." Something shifted in his face, not the settling she had seen before, something more like the beginning of a different expression, one she had not seen there yet, one that took her a moment to categorize. Then he said, "Tuesday morning." She said, "Tuesday morning." He left. She turned back to the administrative records batch on her desk and looked at the page she had been reading when he arrived. She found her place and resumed. On Tuesday morning, she went to his working room for the first time. Dorian showed her in and left, which was, she noted, a departure from the way Dorian normally managed the King's meetings. She sat across from the desk. He was already there. There was coffee. He was holding his cup with both hands. She noticed this and said nothing about it. They discussed the compensation structure for 35 minutes. She had done research on comparable roles in the civil administrative structure. She had access to the relevant salary registries through the archive, and she had come to the meeting with 3 specific reference points and a clear position on what the adjusted salary should be. He listened to all 3. He asked 2 questions. He agreed to the number she had proposed. She said, "You agreed quickly." He said, "You brought accurate references and a reasonable position. There was nothing to negotiate." She said, "Most people negotiate as a matter of form." He said, "I find it wastes time." She thought about this. She said, "I do too." He said, "I know." The meeting was finished at that point in a functional sense, but neither of them moved for a moment. He drank the last of his coffee. She looked at the painting on the wall across from his desk, the southern coast, the softened version of a place she had never been. She said, "Have you been there recently?" He looked at her, then at the painting. He said, "It does not look like that." She said, "I know. I looked at the real coastal surveys in the archive. The geography is accurate, but the quality of the light is wrong." He said, "The quality of the light is wrong." She said, "Whoever painted it preferred the coast to be warmer than it is." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I prefer it as it actually is." She said, "So do I generally." He set down his cup. He looked at her with the attention that was, she had decided over the past 3 months, simply how he looked at things he considered worth looking at. It was not performed and it was not managed. It was present. He said, "Tuesday mornings, would that work as a regular time?" She said, "For what?" He said, "This." She looked at him for a moment. This was a word that covered a considerable amount of ground, from the salary discussion to the painting to the preference for things as they actually were. She did not ask him to specify. She understood him well enough now to know that when he chose a word with that much ground in it, the choice was deliberate. She said, "Tuesday morning's work." She went back to the archive. She sat at her desk. She opened the administrative records batch at the page she had been on since the previous week. Outside the window, the winter light came through at its low angle, honest and cold, nothing softened. She preferred it that way. She had always preferred it that way. She turned the page and kept reading. The Tuesday mornings became, over the following months, their own kind of institution. She would arrive at his working room at 9. Dorian would let her in and leave. The coffee would be there. He would be at his desk or at the window depending on the weight of the week, and she had learned to read those two positions the way she read documents, for what they indicated about the current state of things beneath the surface. At the desk meant the week was moving as planned, the decisions were sequential, the problems were named and being handled. At the window meant something was unresolved. Not necessarily bad, sometimes unresolved simply meant large, the kind of thing that required standing up while you thought about it. But she had learned to notice, and when she noticed, she asked. She asked on the third Tuesday when she found him at the window, and the coffee had gone cold in the cup on his desk. She said, "What is unresolved?" He said without turning, "The investigation, the person who left the country." She said, "The connected vendor." He said, "He is not acting alone, we know this, we do not yet know the shape of the network." She said, "Do you want me to look at something?" He turned, he looked at her, he said, "You have access to everything now." She said, "I know, I am asking whether you want me to look at something specific." He said, "What would you look at?" She said, "The original vendor approval chain, not just budget coordination, the entire approval structure from registration to payment across all departments. If the same pattern appears in multiple locations, the network has more contact points than you have currently identified." He said, "That is a large review." She said, "I have access and time." He said, "It would take weeks." She said, "I know, do you want me to do it?" He said, "Yes." She went back to the archive and started. She spent the next 4 weeks going through the complete vendor and contractor approval records for the preceding 18 months across all Palace departments. She built a cross-reference index more detailed than anything she had produced before. Every vendor registration date, every approval officer, every contract amount, every payment record, every physical address, every company name cross-checked against the city registry. She found 6 additional contact points. 6 other vendors across 4 different departments whose approval chains showed structural irregularities similar to the pre-banquet pattern. Not identical, these were clearly variations designed to avoid the specific signatures that the banquet investigation had documented, but related. The amount thresholds were slightly different. The registration timings were slightly different. The approval officers were different people in different departments, but the underlying structure was the same. She brought the complete analysis to Dorian in a folder rather than through the channel, because the channel was designed for immediate flags, and this was a 4-week research project. Dorian brought it to Aldrich the same morning. Aldrich spent the afternoon reading it. He called George Hay, then he called Edgar Cole. Then he held a meeting that lasted 3 hours and that Myra knew about only in the abstract sense that Dorian told her it had happened. The meeting produced a coordinated investigation across 6 departments that ran for 2 months. At the end of it, the network that had planned the banquet and the related vendor connections had been mapped in their entirety for the first time. 4 individuals in the palace administrative structure were removed from their positions. 12 external actors were identified. The person who had left the country was located through the financial trail that the vendor records provided. Myra learned this from Aldrich on a Tuesday morning, sitting across from his desk, in the low winter light that had, since November, shifted to something approaching the warmth of early spring. He set the final investigation summary aside and said, "The vendor network, you found the structure." She said, "The structure was in the documents, I read the documents." He said, "You spent 4 weeks on a review that was not part of your flagged duties." She said, "I noticed it needed doing." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I want you to know the full result," he told her. He did not summarize or abbreviate. He told her everything in the order it had happened, from the initial 6 contact finding to the final outcome of the 2-month investigation. He told her the way he read things, completely from the beginning. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said, 14 months of preparation." He said, "Yes." She said, "And it was stopped before any of it activated." He said, "Yes." She was quiet. She was thinking about something she had thought about on the night of the banquet. The head table, 6 meters from the ventilation return, 312 people in the dining hall. The number that the preparation had been aimed at. The number that had eaten dinner normally on a Saturday evening and gone home without knowing any of it. She said, "The people in the dining hall." He said, "None of them know." She said, "That is probably correct." He said, "It is how this work functions. The people it protects do not need to know about the protection." She said, I know, I just think about the number sometimes. He looked at her, he said, 312. She said, yes. He said, I think about the same number. They were quiet for a moment, which was not uncomfortable, because they had by now had enough Tuesday mornings to have discovered that silence between them was the same as silence in the archive, full rather than empty. She said, the network is fully mapped now. He said, as far as we can determine. She said, which means there will eventually be another one. He said, yes. She said, then the work continues. He said, yes. She said, good. She picked up her bag. I have a new batch to get through this afternoon. The spring procurement cycle generates a significant volume. He said, Tuesday. She said, Tuesday. She went back to the archive and began the spring procurement batch. Outside the high window, the light had shifted again, imperceptibly, toward something warmer. She noticed it the way she noticed everything, as a fact present and worth recording, part of the ongoing account of a world that kept producing information if you were willing to read it. She was willing, she was always willing. She opened the first document in the batch and began to read. The spring procurement cycle was, as she had told him, a significant volume. 437 documents arrived over the course of the first week of April, the largest single batch she had processed since taking on the expanded role. She worked through them methodically, an hour of reading, 15 minutes of cross-referencing, notes on anything that caught her attention. Most of it was clean. Clean in her assessment meant consistent, explainable, and matching the records it was supposed to match. She moved through clean documents quickly and without stopping, the way a reader moves through text that is saying what it is supposed to say. The spring cycle was largely clean. 242 documents clean, 67 clean with minor notations, 91 requiring a second read. Of the 91 that required a second read, 12 required a third. Of the 12 that required a third read, 2 went into the channel. Neither of the 2 channel flags produced a non-benign result. One was an administrative error. One was a vendor name that had changed through a legitimate corporate restructuring and had not been updated in the palace registry. She logged both results, updated the notes, and moved on. This was the rhythm. This was what the work looked like when it was running correctly, most of it clean, some of it requiring attention, a very small portion requiring action, and almost none of that action producing the kind of acute crisis that had opened all of this. The acute crisis was the exception. The systematic, careful reading was the rule. She was suited for the rule in ways she had not fully understood when she was working in a scope that no one saw. Now someone saw. The Tuesday mornings continued through spring, through early summer. The coffee was there. He was at the desk some weeks and at the window others. The painting of the southern coast hung on the wall, its light still wrong, the geography still accurate. She had learned to look at it the way she looked at documents that were almost right, as a version of the truth that required a correction to be fully itself. She had not corrected him about the painting. She did not need to. He had said he preferred the coast as it actually was. That was the correction. Some things, once said accurately, stayed accurate without being said again. The work continued. The spring became summer. The flags went through the channel. The Tuesday mornings held. And every week, without fail, the archive received its new batches of documents. And every week, without fail, Myra Solon sat down and began to read. The work was not over. The work was never over. That was the nature of institutions. They kept producing information, and the information kept telling the truth, and the truth kept mattering, and someone needed to be paying attention. She was paying attention. She had always been paying attention. The difference now was that the attention had somewhere to go, and the somewhere knew how to use it. She turned to the next document in the batch, picked up her pen, and began. 7 months after the banquet, a new problem arrived from the north. It came in the form of a diplomatic dispatch, 3 pages long, written in the formal language of a neighboring state's foreign affairs office, and it said, in the careful way that diplomatic dispatches said difficult things, that there had been an incident involving the palace's trade mission in the northern city of Vale, and that the incident had resulted in the detention of 2 palace trade representatives, and that the matter was being handled through the usual channels, and that the neighboring state wished to resolve it quickly and without escalation. The dispatch arrived on a Monday. It was routed to the Foreign Affairs Secretary, who prepared a briefing and brought it to Aldrich on Monday afternoon. Aldrich read the briefing, he asked 3 questions, he received 3 answers. He thanked the Foreign Affairs Secretary and sent him back to begin the standard diplomatic response process. Then he looked at Dorian and said, "Pull the trade mission documentation from the archive, everything from the past year." Dorian said, "Is this about the dispatch?" Aldrich said, "The dispatch mentions the usual channels. I want to know what the usual channels look like for the Vale mission, because the Vale mission has not had an incident in its 7-year operating history, and a first incident does not normally originate in the usual channels." Dorian said, "I will have the archivist pull it." Aldrich said, "Ask her to read it too." He had, over the course of the Tuesday mornings, stopped phrasing requests through Dorian as relay. He still used Dorian as the operational coordinator for most tasks, but when he wanted something read rather than simply retrieved, he said so directly. The distinction mattered. Myra received the request through Dorian at 4 in the afternoon and had already begun pulling the Vale trade mission documentation before he finished explaining what it was for. She had a copy of the diplomatic dispatch in front of her within the hour. The archive received copies of all incoming foreign correspondence as a matter of standard filing. She read the dispatch first, then she read the trade mission records, 7 years of operational logs, correspondence, supply chain documentation, staff registrations, expense records, and quarterly reports. She read through the night. At 6 in the morning, she was at her desk with a cup of tea she had made from the kettle in the back room, and she had something to say. She did not wait for Tuesday. She wrote a summary, 3 pages, and sent it through the channel marked priority. Dorian received it at 7:15 and brought it to Aldrich at 7:30. Aldrich read it. The summary said, in Myra's precise and unperformed language, the following. The Vale Trade Mission had employed, for the past 14 months, a local coordination firm whose registration in the Northern Business Registry appeared legitimate but whose 2 named principals were, according to a cross-reference with the Northern City's public administrative records that were accessible through a reciprocal archive agreement the palace maintained with the Northern State. The same individuals who appeared in the public corporate registry of a company that was the subject of an ongoing commercial dispute with the neighboring state's Ministry of Trade. The coordination firm's access to the trade mission's operational schedule would have included the itinerary and movements of the 2 detained representatives. The detention had occurred during an unscheduled deviation from the standard mission route, a deviation that had been arranged through the coordination firm's office. The summary concluded, "I cannot determine from these records whether the incident was deliberately facilitated or whether the coordination firm's connection to the ongoing dispute is coincidental. What I can say is that the connection exists, that it was not identified when the coordination firm was retained, and that the 2 detained representatives were in a location they should not have been, arranged through a party with a possible interest in their being there." Aldrich set the summary down. He looked at Dorian. He said, "How long did she have the documents?" Dorian said, "Since approximately 4 yesterday afternoon." Aldrich said, 14 hours. Dorian said, "Yes." Aldrich said, "Call the Foreign Affairs Secretary. Tell him to pause the standard diplomatic response. And tell him we are going to have a conversation about the Vale coordination firm before we say anything to anyone." Dorian made the calls. The diplomatic response was paused. The Foreign Affairs Secretary came to the North Wing at 9 o'clock, having had no sleep and a great deal of anxiety about the 2 detained representatives, and received from Aldrich a briefing that rearranged his understanding of the situation considerably. Aldrich did not tell him the source of the analysis. He told him what the analysis contained. The source was not relevant to the conversation about what to do next. What happened next over the following 2 weeks was a careful and precisely targeted diplomatic intervention that was not about the standard channels at all. It bypassed the coordination firm entirely, went directly to the neighboring state's foreign ministry, and established within 8 days that the detention of the 2 representatives had been facilitated by the same commercial dispute the coordination firm's principals were involved in, a dispute in which the representatives' testimony would have been valuable. The representatives were released on the 9th day. They came home on the 10th. The coordination firm's contract was terminated. The business relationship was reconstructed through a different and properly vetted local partner. None of this appeared in the public diplomatic record. It appeared in the internal files. It appeared in Aldrich's locked drawer. It appeared in the archive in Myra's filing under Trade Mission Records, Vale Operations, flagged and annotated. Myra learned the outcome on a Tuesday morning, sitting across from the desk with the coffee and the wrong light painting on the wall. He told her the complete result, as he always did. When he finished, he said, "The Foreign Affairs Secretary asked me where the analysis came from." She said, "What did you tell him?" He said, "I told him it came from someone who reads carefully." She looked at him. "That is not a full answer." He said he did not need a full answer. He needed to understand that the information was reliable and that the method that produced it is now part of how this palace operates. She said, "And if it comes up again?" He said, "It will come up again. When it does, I will explain the role, but the explanation begins with the result, not the source. The result has to speak first." She thought about this. She thought about the years of being a source without a result, the years of reading carefully and having no place for the reading to go. The results had always been there inside the documents. She had simply been alone with them. She said, "I want to brief the Foreign Affairs Secretary directly at some point." He looked at her. "About the role." She said, "About how documents talk. Senior officials who work with foreign states produce a great deal of documentation. If they understand what I look for and why, they will flag things for my attention before they reach the point of crisis." He said, "You want to train the senior staff?" She said, "Not train, explain, there is a difference." He said, "What is the difference?" She said, "Training tells people what to do. Explaining tells people why it matters. People who understand why make better decisions than people who know what." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "Set it up with Dorian, all senior staff. Any department that interacts with external parties." She said, "That will take several months." He said, "I know." She said, "It will also require me to be in rooms with people who outrank me significantly, explaining things to them." He said, "Is that a problem?" She thought about it. She thought about Ivan Wren's desk and Ada Faye's patient dismissal. She thought about standing in the North Wing at 9 in the morning with a document envelope and no rank and no authority. She thought about where she sat now. She said, "No, it is not a problem." He said, "Good." She said, "I will need the formal position document to be accessible to them in advance. They will engage differently if they see the role in writing before I walk in." He said, "Dorian will send it." She said, "With a cover note." He said, "What kind of cover note?" She said, "The kind that says this person's assessment is to be treated as primary source intelligence, in plain language, not protocol language." He looked at her. "I will write it." She said, "I know, that is why I asked for it." Something shifted in his face. She had been cataloging the expressions she had seen there over 7 months with the same attention she brought to documents, building an index of what each one corresponded to. This one she had seen before, the settling, the moment when something that was in motion arrived at a place and stayed. He said, "You knew I would write it before you asked." She said, "I knew you prefer plain language, and that the cover note needed plain language, and that you would not send it through the protocol office if I gave you a reason not to." He said, "And the reason?" She said, "I asked for it specifically. That is reason enough for you." He said nothing for a moment, then he said, "Yes, it is." She picked up her bag. She had 3 batches to get through before noon. The spring procurement was clean, but the summer external contracts cycle was beginning, and external contracts were always worth reading carefully. She stood to go. He said, "Myra." She stopped. He had used her first name a small number of times before, and each time had been a deliberate departure from the more formal usage, and she had noted each departure the way she noted anomalies, as something outside the expected pattern, informative by virtue of its difference. He said, "What was on line 1 of page 47? She looked at him. "The date, I told you that in November." He said, "I know, I wanted to hear it again." She looked at him for a moment longer than the question required. Then she said, "The 14th, a Tuesday." He said, "And line 2? She said, "A weather notation. I was cross-referencing a supply delivery that was affected by the weather that week." He said, and line 3. She said, East Wing, shelf row 7, low vent, south wall. Chemical smell, not on any maintenance schedule. He said, and that was where it started. She said, that was where I started writing it down. It started before that. He said, before the smell. She said, before everything. It started with reading. It always starts with reading. He said, and you never stopped. She said, no. She left. She walked back through the north corridor, past the guard at the administrative entrance who had long since stopped tracking her movements with any attention, because her presence in this part of the building had, over 7 months, become as unremarkable as the furniture. She went back to the archive, sat down, and pulled the first summer contract batch toward her. She opened her notebook to a new page. She wrote the date at the top. She picked up her pen. She began to read. Outside, the summer light came through the high window at a different angle than in winter, warmer and more direct, filling the archive with a quality of light that was nothing like the painting. The painting was not this archive. The painting was a softened version of something real, and she had always preferred the real. She read the first page of the first contract and turned to the second. On the third page, something caught her eye. She read it twice. She wrote it on line 1 of the new page. She turned to the fourth page and kept going. The work continued. It always continued. That was the point. The summer briefings began in August. She had spent June and July preparing for them. Not preparing what to say, she knew what to say. She had been saying it in archive rooms and North Wing offices and Tuesday morning meetings for the better part of a year. She was preparing how to say it to rooms full of people for whom information management was not an abstract concept, but an immediate operational reality, and who would therefore have questions she needed to be ready for. She read everything she could find about how the senior staff operated, which was, given her access, a considerable amount. She built profiles in her notebook, what each department head understood about documentation, what their departments generated, where the gaps tended to be. She reflected, doing for the briefings what she did for everything, reading carefully before acting. The first briefing was with the Foreign Affairs Secretary and his 3 senior staff. She arrived at his department's conference room at 9 on a Wednesday morning in August with her notebook, a printed copy of the core policy document, and the cover note that Aldrich had written, which she had read once when Dorian sent it and then put away because she did not need to read it again to know what it said. The Foreign Affairs Secretary was a man named Arthur Crane. He was 63, had been in his role for 14 years, and had the bearing of someone who had conducted more foreign negotiations than he could accurately count, and had therefore developed, as a professional reflex, the habit of assessing every person who sat across from him within the first 30 seconds of their interaction. She let him assess her. She sat across from him with her notebook and the policy document and the cover note that Aldrich had written in plain language and which Arthur Crane had read, because she could tell from the way he looked at her that he had read it. She said, I am going to tell you what I look for in documents and why it matters to your department, and then I am going to ask you questions about how your department generates and routes its documentation, because I cannot read documents I do not receive. Arthur Crane said, the cover note said to treat your assessment as primary source intelligence. She said, yes. He said, in 14 years, I have received that designation for 3 other individuals. She said, do you want to know whether I am comparable to them? He said, I want to know how you work. She said, good, that is the right question. She told him how she read, what she looked for, what the structural patterns of deliberate irregularity looked like versus innocent error, how the cross-referencing worked, what kinds of documents were most likely to carry useful information, what kinds of administrative processes were most commonly exploited. She told him specifically about the Vale Trade Mission analysis without naming herself as the source. She told it as a case study, a demonstration of the method, with the outcome already known to him. When she finished, Arthur Crane looked at her for a moment, then he said, you did that in 14 hours. She said, I had the relevant documents in hand, the cross-reference took time. The analysis itself was relatively fast once the cross-reference was complete. He said, what do you need from my department? She said, copies of all incoming diplomatic correspondence routed to my archive access within 24 hours of receipt. copies of outgoing correspondence within 48 hours, and any internal briefings that reference external parties, particularly parties with commercial or political interests that intersect with palace operations. He said, that is a significant amount of material. She said, I am aware. I am also aware that most of it will be clean and will be processed quickly. What matters is the portion that is not. He said, how often is it not? She said, in the past 7 months, of approximately 3,000 documents reviewed across all departments, 14 required follow-up, 2 produced non-benign results, and 1 produced a result significant enough to alter a diplomatic response. He said, the veil situation. She said, yes. He thought about this. He said, 1 in 3,000. She said, 1 in 3,000, which is why you read all 3,000. Arthur Crane looked at her for a long moment. She recognized the look, the same recalibration she had seen in Edgar Cole, in Dorian, in the people who encountered the method for the first time, and had to adjust their understanding of what was possible from a single person with access and time and the willingness to read carefully. He said, I will have the routing adjusted by end of week. She said, thank you. She opened to a clean page in her notebook. Now, tell me how your department handles third-party coordination agreements. He told her. She listened. She asked 3 questions. She wrote down 2 things. Then she moved to the next topic on her list. The briefing lasted 2 hours and 20 minutes, which was longer than the original 1-hour slot Arthur Crane had set aside. At the end, he stood and shook her hand, which she noted, because in her experience, handshakes from senior officials to junior ones were not common, and she was still, in the formal structural sense, junior, and said, I should have known this was happening in the archive. She said, now you do. He said, will you come back, quarterly at least? There will be things that come up that I would like your read on. She said, yes, set it up with Dorian. She left the Foreign Affairs Department and walked back through the North Wing to the archive. She sat at her desk, opened her notebook, and wrote a half-page summary of what she had learned about the Foreign Affairs documentation process and the routing gaps she intended to close. Then she returned to the summer contract batch. Over August and September, she briefed 7 department heads. Each briefing was different because each department was different. The risk profiles varied, the documentation volumes varied, the specific vulnerabilities varied. She adapted the presentation each time based on what she had read about the department in preparation, and in each case she came away with new routing agreements that expanded the volume of documents she received and reduced the lag between generation and review. By October, her daily document volume had more than doubled. She worked longer hours, not unsustainable hours. She was precise about the distinction between thorough and exhausting, but longer than before and more varied. The archive was still the center of it, but the center was larger now, and the edges of it reached across the entire palace in ways they had not when she was simply the East Wing archivist who catalogued everything more efficiently than the job required. On a Tuesday morning in October, she was at his desk at 9. The coffee was there. He was at the window, not at the desk, at the window. She set her bag down. She looked at him. She said, what is unresolved? He said, the outer network, 3 of the 12 external actors from the Banquet investigation. We know who they are. We do not yet know who they report to. She said, that is an external intelligence problem. He said, yes. It is not solvable from documents inside the palace. She said, then it is not currently mine to solve. He said, no. She said, is that what is keeping you at the window? He was quiet for a moment, then he said, partly. She said, what is the other part? He turned from the window. He looked at her with the full attention that she had over 10 months of Tuesday mornings, stopped being surprised by and started simply accepting as the way he looked at her, specifically, as distinct from the way he looked at other things. He said, I received a proposal this week from the Northern Regional Council. They are proposing a formal trade alignment that would require a senior palace representative to be stationed in Vale for 1 year. She said, that is significant politically. He said, yes, and the natural candidate for the role, based on regional expertise and existing relationships with the Northern Council, is Arthur Crane. She said, you do not want to lose Arthur Crane for a year. He said, I do not want to lose him for a year, but more than that. He stopped. She waited. He said, if he goes to Vale, I need someone who understands the foreign affairs documentation at the same depth he does to manage the information flow here. Someone who has already built the routing relationships with his department and can maintain continuity. She said, that would be me. He said, that would be you, which means the role changes again, not just reading, active management of a significant diplomatic information stream. She said, I know the Vale files. He said, you know every file. She said, yes. He said, is that something you can take on? She looked at him, she thought about the question, which deserved a real answer and not a reflexive one. She thought about the volume of work that would expand from this. She thought about the Tuesday mornings and the briefings and the channel and the archive and the notebooks, all of it running simultaneously, all of it interconnected, all of it held together by the fact that she was the thread running through it. She said, yes, with one condition. He said, name it. She said, I need an assistant, not to read for me, to handle the administrative routing and coordination so I am reading instead of managing logistics. He said, done. She said, someone I choose. He said, done. She said, someone from outside the standard hierarchy. He looked at her, you want someone who has been overlooked. She said, I want someone who reads carefully. The hierarchical position is secondary. He said, is there someone specific? She said, there is a junior records officer in the West Wing named Clara Foyle. She has been in the post for 3 years. Her efficiency ratings are the highest in the department, and her supervisor's annual review notes describe her as detail-oriented in a tone that suggests he finds this mildly inconvenient. He said, detail-oriented inconveniently. She said, yes, which means she notices things her supervisor would prefer remained unnoticed. He said, sound familiar. She said nothing. He said, Clara Foyle, done. She picked up her bag. She had the Vale files to begin rereading with the new context. She had a summer contract batch still in progress. She had, beginning this week, additional routing from 3 departments whose briefings had concluded in September. She stood, she said, the painting. He said, yes. She said, the southern coast, have you been recently? He said, not in 2 years. She said, I have not been at all. He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, very carefully, in the same precise and unperformed language he used for everything, that could be addressed. She said, it could. She left. She walked back to the archive. She sat at her desk and opened her notebook to a new page and wrote the date and the time and one line, Coastal Survey Records, Southern Region. She would need to know the real geography if she was ever going to see the real coast. She always read before she went somewhere. She picked up her pen and began. Clara Foyle arrived in the archive on a Monday morning in November carrying a small bag, a notebook of her own, and the particular expression of someone who has been told they are being reassigned without being told why, and who has therefore been in a state of low-level professional anxiety for the past 72 hours. She was 26. She had dark red hair, cut practically short, and a face that held its expression carefully in the way people do when they are good at their jobs and accustomed to being underestimated anyway. She had been in the West Wing Records office for 3 years. Her efficiency ratings were, as Myra had noted, the highest in the department. She stood in the archive doorway and looked at the room, the shelves, the desk, the high window, the small kettle in the back room. She looked at Myra. She said, I was told to report here. Myra said, yes, come in and sit down. Clara sat. Myra said, your supervisor's annual review notes describe you as detail-oriented. Clara's expression shifted slightly, not defensively, more the look of someone who has been told something accurate about themselves that they are not sure whether to be pleased or concerned about. Clara said, he found it inconvenient. Myra said, I know, I read the note. Clara said, why am I here? Myra said, because you read carefully and I need someone who reads carefully, not to read for me. To manage what comes and goes from this room so that I am reading instead of routing. Clara said, you are the institutional reader. Myra said, you know the role. Clara said, the policy document went to all departments last spring. I read it. Myra said, what did you think of it? Clara said, without hesitation, I thought the independent assessment filing requirement was the important clause, the one that prevents someone from suppressing a review by seniority. Myra looked at her. Why that one? Clara said, because the rest of the policy creates channels. Channels are only useful if there is a mechanism that keeps them from being blocked by the people they run through. That clause is the mechanism. Myra said, how long did it take you to read the document? Clara said, 20 minutes. Myra said, and to arrive at that conclusion? Clara said, while reading it. Myra turned back to the desk. She said, your first task is to set up a routing log for the incoming document flow. I will explain the current system. You will build the log from that explanation. I want it done by Wednesday. Clara said, what format? Myra said, your choice. Show me Wednesday and I will tell you whether it works. She explained the routing system. Clara wrote in her own notebook. She asked 4 questions. Myra answered 3 of them directly and responded to the 4th by pulling a reference document and letting Clara read it, because the answer was in the document and reading the document directly was more efficient than an explanation. Clara read the document, found the answer, and asked no further questions. By Wednesday, the routing log was on Myra's desk. She read it. She changed 2 things, she approved the rest. Clara Foyle was in the archive. The work expanded again. The 2-month period that followed was the most complex stretch Myra had worked through since the weeks before the banquet, but different in quality, complex in volume and scope rather than in urgency. Arthur Crane had gone to Vail. The Foreign Affairs information stream now ran through the archive in a volume that required daily management. The summer contract review was still ongoing. The Northern investigation, the 3 unidentified external actors from the banquet plot, was generating periodic documentation that Edgar Cole sent through the channel for her assessment. She managed all of it with Clara beside her. Clara routing, coordinating, logging, and occasionally flagging things herself when she found something in the incoming volume that she thought warranted attention. On a Thursday in December, Clara put a document on Myra's desk and said, I noticed something. Myra looked at the document. It was a routine equipment procurement form from the East Wing Facilities office. Clara had circled a vendor name in pencil. Myra read the vendor name. She read the document. She pulled up the vendor registry on the catalog system. The vendor had been in the registry for 3 years. It was a legitimate company. The contract amount was small. Nothing about it was structurally irregular. She looked at Clara. Why did you flag it? Clara said, the company is registered at an address in the Eastern District. The address appears in the business registry, but not in the city property records I checked. It might be a newer address not yet updated in property records, or it might be a registration address that does not correspond to an active location. Myra said, you checked the city property records. Clara said, I have access through the archive reciprocal agreement. Myra said, on your own initiative. Clara said, should I not have? Myra looked at her for a moment, then she said, pull the company's full registry history, 3 years of activity. Clara pulled it. It showed consistent, low-value East Wing equipment contracts over 3 years, all small, all approved correctly, all within the standard facilities procurement routing. Myra read through it. Then she said, the property address. Clara said, it appears in the business registry with a registration date 14 months ago. The property records database, which updates monthly, does not have a current active listing for that address. Myra said, 14 months ago. Clara looked at her, that is relevant. Myra said, 14 months was when the Greywood Network began establishing its contractor presence. This company has a different profile, legitimate history, small contracts, East Wing only, but a registration address update 14 months ago that does not appear in the property records. Clara said, do you think they are connected? Myra said, I do not know, that is the point, send it through the channel today. Clara sent it. Edgar Cole's team received it by noon. The result came back in 4 days. The property address update corresponded to a change in the company's ownership, filed correctly with the business registry, through a transaction that traced back to a holding company whose principals included one of the 3 unidentified external actors from the banquet investigation. The 3 external actors were no longer unidentified by the time the week was out. Myra learned this on a Tuesday morning. Aldrich told her the full result as always. When he finished, he said, "Clara Foyle." Myra said, "Yes." He said, "She flagged it." Myra said, "She noticed the property record discrepancy and brought it to me." He said, "On her own initiative." Myra said, "On her 3rd week." He said, "You chose well." Myra said, "I read her file." He looked at her for a moment, then he said, "The network is fully mapped, all 3 actors are identified, the investigation can now close." She said, "Does it feel different when an investigation closes?" He said, "It feels like a pause, not an ending." She said, "Because there will be another one." He said, "Yes. There is always another one." She said, "Then the pause is what matters." He said, "The pause and the preparation." She said, "The preparation is what we do between pauses." He said, "Yes." She picked up her coffee. She had been drinking coffee on Tuesday mornings for 7 months because he had coffee, and she had been offered some on the first Tuesday and had accepted and had not thereafter stopped. She did not examine this particularly. It was simply one of the small, unremarkable things that had developed between them over the course of Tuesday mornings and document discussions and precise answers to precise questions. She said, "The southern coast." He said, "Yes." She said, "The palace closes in January for the administrative break." He said, "Yes." She said, "I have never taken a full leave period. I have always worked through." He said, "I know." She said, "This year I am considering not working through." He said, "That is reasonable." She said, "I am also considering seeing the actual coast." He said, "It is cold in January." She said, "I read the climate records." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I go every year in January." She said, "I know, I catalogued your travel schedule." He looked at her, something had shifted again in his face, the expression she had seen before and not yet fully named, the one that was not the settling, the one that was the beginning of something. He said, "Would you like to see it together, the actual coast?" She looked at him, she said, "I would need to know the itinerary." He said, "I will have Dorian send it." She said, "With the property and terrain survey?" He said, "Of course." She said, "I will read it first." He said, "I assumed you would." She said, "Then yes." She picked up her bag. She had 8 hours of work ahead of her, a new batch of Northern Trade Mission updates, a follow-up meeting with the Foreign Ministry about Vale, and a routing review with Clara at 4. She stood up. He said, "Myra." She stopped. He said, "Page 47. She turned to look at him. He said, "I want you to know that I have thought about it, all year, the 3rd line. The fact that you wrote it down." She said, "I was going to write it down regardless of what happened afterward. That is what I do." He said, "I know, that is what I have been thinking about." She said, "What specifically?" He said that you did the thing that mattered before anyone acknowledged that it mattered, before you had a channel, before there was a reason to expect anyone to listen. You wrote it down because you noticed it and because noticing it required writing it down, not for an audience, for the work itself. She looked at him, she said, "Yes." He said, "That is rare." She said, "I know." He said, "I wanted you to know that I understand what it cost. The 5 days before you found a person who would listen. The years before that, doing the work without anyone seeing it." She was quiet for a moment. She looked at the painting on the wall, the wrong light, the accurate geography. She said, "You are not required to say this." He said, "I know, that is why I am saying it." She looked at him for a long moment. The archive of all the Tuesday mornings was inside her somewhere, organized and cross-referenced the way everything she kept was organized and cross-referenced, and this moment was going into it too, clearly and precisely, because she did not let things she noticed go unrecorded. She said, "Thank you." She left. She walked back to the archive. Clara was at the routing desk working through the morning's incoming volume. She looked up when Myra came in. She said, "The Northern Trade update batch is in." Myra sat down. She said, "I will start it this afternoon. What is the volume?" Clara said, 43 documents. Myra said, Flag anything from the Vale coordination chain specifically. The new partner has only been in place for 2 months, and I want to watch the early documentation carefully. Clara made a note. She said, "Understood." They worked. The morning moved through itself. The archive was what it had always been. Quiet, organized, full of the accumulated record of a world that did not always see itself clearly, generating information that needed someone to read it. Myra read it. She had always read it. She would continue to read it, in this room, in this chair, with this window and its strip of changing sky, for as long as there were documents to be read and things inside them that mattered. The difference from a Tuesday morning nearly a year ago was that the reading was no longer invisible. She had made it visible. He had seen it. A system had changed because of it. People were alive on a Saturday night who might not have been, sitting in their homes after a banquet they had attended without knowing the shape of what had moved around them. She turned to the first document in the northern batch. She read it. She turned to the second. Outside the high window, the December sky was doing what it always did in December, going pale and gray by mid-afternoon, pulling the light back toward the horizon, leaving the archive in the warm yellow of the overhead lamp. She had worked under this lamp for 4 years in the dark months. It had not changed. The room had not changed. The shelves had not changed. She had changed, not in ways that were visible from outside, perhaps, but inside the reading, inside the quiet, precise work of paying attention to what the world was actually saying versus what it appeared to say. Inside that, something had shifted that did not shift back. She knew more. She could see further. The network that connected what she found to what the kingdom could do about it was real now, built and tested and working. And beside her, a 26-year-old with dark red hair and a pencil in her hand was already reading the world the same way, and would read it the same way for years to come, and would carry the method forward into rooms and situations that Myra could not yet foresee. That was how it lasted, not in announcements or ceremonies or records bearing the right names, in the passing forward of the practice, in the next person who noticed something and wrote it down and did not let it go. Clara put a document on the desk. She said, "Line 14. The approval signature does not match the signatory's title as listed in the departmental registry." Myra looked at line 14. She read it. She said, "Note it and keep reading." Clara noted it and kept reading. Myra turned back to the northern batch. The kingdom continued. The documents arrived. The reading went on. And a woman who had once been invisible in the east wing of a palace, who had knelt on a floor between shelves and pressed a loose panel back into place with both palms, and noticed a smell that had no business being there, sat at her desk in the archive and turned another page, and the page after that, and the page after that. Because someone had to. Because she was the one who did. Because this was what it meant to pay attention. She turned the page. The investigation closure came with a formality that Myra found, in its own quiet way, moving. Edgar Cole sent the final summary through the official security record system. Dorian filed a copy in the North Wing Operational Archive. George Hayes' team produced a debrief document that ran to 30 pages, and which Myra read in its entirety on a Friday afternoon, sitting in the archive with the winter light coming through the high window and Clara at the routing desk organizing the week's incoming volume. The 30-page debrief documented everything: the original preparation, the false contractor chain, the banquet event, the investigation that followed, the 6 additional contact points she had found in the full vendor review, and the final identification of the 3 external actors in December. It documented the changes to palace security protocols, the new intake channel, the departmental briefings, and the structural reforms that had followed from the events of the previous year. Myra's name appeared in the document 6 times. She counted. She was not sure what to do with this. Her name had appeared on precisely 0 documents of official significance before the banquet: the position document, the access card upgrade. The policy change that did not name her but that everyone in the senior staff understood. The cover note that Aldrich had written in plain language, 6 instances in a 30-page debrief. She was in the record now. The work was in the record. She closed the debrief and filed it in the evidence section of the East Wing Operational Records, where it joined the photographs she had printed of her original notebook pages, the photographs she had sent to Dorian's desk in an envelope nearly a year ago. The envelope was in the evidence section too. She had added it to the archive in September, when she was doing a comprehensive organization of the banquet investigation materials. She had held it for a moment before filing it. A plain envelope, addressed in her own handwriting to a name she had not been sure would matter. It had mattered. The handwriting was the same as it had always been. She filed the debrief beside it and closed the drawer. On the last Tuesday morning before the January break, she arrived at his working room at 9. The coffee was there. He was at the desk, which meant the week was moving as planned. She sat across from him. She said, "The debrief." He said, "I know you read it." She said, "6 times." He said, "I know." She said, "The 30th page." He said, "Yes." The 30th page of the debrief was the final section, which summarized the lessons derived from the year's events and the changes implemented as a result. It was dry language, the kind that operational documents required, careful and precise, and without personal inflection. The second paragraph of the final section described the establishment of the institutional document intelligence role, its function, and its results over the 10 months it had been in operation. The last sentence of that paragraph read, "The role was established as a direct result of intelligence provided by the occupant prior to any formal mandate, demonstrating that the capacity for this kind of analysis existed within the institution before the institution was structured to receive it." She had read that sentence 4 times. She said, "That sentence." He said, "Yes." She said, "Did you review the debrief draft?" He said, "I reviewed all 30 pages." She said, "Did you write that sentence?" He said, "No, Edgar Cole wrote it." She looked at him. She said, "Edgar Cole." He said he asked to write the lessons section himself. I read it and approved it. That sentence was his. She was quiet for a moment, then she said, "Tell him I read it." He said, "I will." She looked at the desk between them. She looked at the coffee. She looked at the painting with its wrong light and its accurate geography. She thought about a man who had been the palace security chief for 11 years, who had spent a week after the banquet in controlled professional recalibration, who had redesigned his intake system and briefed his department and changed how his operation worked, and who had written a sentence that said, in the plain language of an official document, she did this before anyone asked her to. She said, "The January trip." He said, "Dorian sent the itinerary." She said, "I read it." He said, "And?" She said, "The terrain survey showed the cliff elevation is higher than the painting suggests." He said, "The painter stood well back." She said, "Why?" He said, "He was afraid of heights." She said, "And painted a coastline." He said, "He specialized in coastlines." She said, "The cliff face in the survey shows a specific rock formation that would be visible from the beach. It is not in the painting." He said, "The painter may not have noticed it." She said, "Or he noticed it and did not include it because it disrupted the composition." He said, "Is that worse?" She said, "To notice something real and leave it out because it complicates the picture." "Yes." He said, "You would not have left it out." She said, "No, I would have moved the composition." He looked at her. He said, "I know." She said, "The rock formation is visible at low tide only. The itinerary shows arrival midday. If the tides are favorable, we would have an hour at the correct angle." He said, "You checked the tide tables." She said, "They are in the coastal survey records." He said, "Of course they are." She said, "Do you want to see the rock formation?" He said, "I want to see whatever you think is worth seeing." She looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I think almost everything is worth seeing if you are looking at it correctly." He said, "I know." She picked up her bag. She had 2 weeks before January. The northern batch was ongoing. The Vale routing needed a final review before Arthur Crane's first full quarterly report arrived from the north. Clara needed a briefing on the tide table records, not because they were immediately relevant, but because Myra had learned from the banquet that the documents that seemed irrelevant were sometimes the most important ones, and she intended to ensure that Clara understood the coastal operational files before they came up in something urgent. She stood. She said, 2 weeks. He said, 2 weeks. She said, "I will finish the northern batch before the break." He said, "I did not ask." She said, "I know. I am telling you." He said, "All right." She said, and I will leave the archive organized for Clara. He said, she will manage. She said, she will manage better with a clean system. He said, yes. She said, 2 weeks. She left, she walked back to the archive and sat at her desk and pulled the Northern batch toward her and found the page she had been on and continued reading. Clara was at the routing desk. The document flow was organized, the channel was clear, the incoming volume was manageable. Everything was as it was supposed to be. She read through the afternoon, through the early dark of December, through the lamplight that had accompanied every working day for the past nearly 5 years. She noticed 3 things in the Northern batch. 2 were benign. One went through the channel at 4:30, flagged for Arthur Crane's review team in Vale. At 6 she closed the batch, organized her desk and turned off the lamp. Clara said good night. Myra said good night. The Vale routing is flagged for Tuesday, do not process it without me. Clara said understood. Myra put on her coat and picked up her bag and walked out of the archive. She walked down the east corridor and out through the staff entrance into the December evening. The air was cold, the kind of cold that came with clarity, a sharp, clean quality that had nothing softened in it, that was the real temperature of a real December evening and nothing else. She stood on the steps for a moment and breathed it in. She thought about page 47, 3rd line. A cold morning, a smell, the decision to write it down. She thought about the banquet, and the head table, and 312 people who had eaten dinner without knowing. She thought about a 30-page debrief, and a sentence on the last page. She thought about tide tables, and rock formations visible only at low tide. Then she stopped thinking and started walking, because the evening was cold and clear, and she had 2 weeks to finish the Northern batch before January, and the work was never finished, and that was the point. She walked home through the December dark. The city moved around her, the same city it had always been, the same indifferent and ordinary movement. She was the same person she had always been in most of the ways that mattered. The reading was the same. The attention was the same. The notebook, always open, always with a new page, was the same. Everything that had changed was, in a sense, external to that. The channel, the role, the access, the Tuesday mornings, the 53 pages of evidence that had become a reformed security system, that had become a network of careful readers working across a palace to ensure that the next time something wrong appeared in the documents, it would not spend 5 days looking for someone to listen. She had built that from a floor between shelves, with a loose panel and a smell and a pen. She turned down her street. The bakery on the corner was still lit. She stopped and went in and bought bread, which was an ordinary thing to do at 6:15 on a December evening, and she paid for it and left and walked to her door and let herself in. She put the bread on the table, she hung up her coat, she turned on the lamp by the window. She sat down, opened her bag and took out her notebook. She opened it to a new page. She wrote the date at the top. She wrote one line, Tide Tables, Southern Coast, January window, to review. Then she closed the notebook, left it on the table and made dinner. The city moved through its ordinary evening outside her window. The lamp was warm, the bread was on the table. And somewhere in the palace, in an archive room she had turned into something larger than an archive, the shelves held their silence, full of everything the world had written down about itself, waiting patiently for the morning when she would come back and read. She always came back. She always read. And what she read had somewhere to go. That was the whole of it, that was what had changed, that was what mattered. She sat at the window and ate her dinner and watched the ordinary city go about its ordinary evening, and she was part of it, which she had always been, and seen within it, which she had not always been, and the difference between those 2 things was everything. The lamp stayed on until late. She was reading.